Theodore Vance stood in the middle of Mabel's bedroom. Not her childhood bedroom, but the one she'd shared her whole life with the possibility of becoming someone. And he picked up her mother's pearl brooch, the only thing left from the woman who'd raised her, and he dropped it into his coat pocket without a word. "You won't be needing sentimental objects where you're going," he said. "A wife of mine travels light and looks the part, neither of which you currently manage." He turned to face her then, and the smile on his face was the kind that never reached the eyes. "Look at yourself, Mabel. Really look." He gestured toward the mirror on the wardrobe. "I spent a considerable sum on that dress, and it still can't hide what you are. Do you have any idea what people say when we walk into a room together?" She didn't answer. She'd learned not to. "They say Theodore Vance must owe someone a great debt." He laughed. It was a short, clean sound, like something being cut. "Now pack what fits in one bag. We leave for the Hargrove dinner at 7, and you will smile and you will be quiet. And if anyone asks how we met, you'll say it was at the opera, not at my cousin's flour mill, where you were working the counter with flour on your chin. If you've ever felt like someone looked right through you, like your worth was something other people got to decide, then this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end, because this one doesn't go where you think it's going. If you're watching from somewhere out in this wide world, drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one, and it means everything to know how far these stories travel. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. We put our whole hearts into every story we tell here. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The town of Ferris Hollow sat in the valley below the Granite Divide like something the mountains had coughed up and forgotten. It had a general store, a livery, a post office that doubled as a barber shop on Thursdays, and the particular cruelty that comes from small places where everyone knows everyone else's business and almost no one ever leaves. Mabel Ashcroft had grown up on the eastern edge of town, in a 2-room house that always smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs because her mother believed strongly in both fire and medicine. Her mother had died 4 years ago, quietly and without complaint, the same way she had lived, and Mabel had been alone since then. Alone in the way that has nothing to do with whether other people are present. Theodore Vance had come into her life the way certain disasters do, gradually, then all at once. He was 15 years her senior, prosperous in the vague way of men whose money comes from enough different places that no one can quite trace it, and he had expressed interest in Mabel at a time when expressing interest in her felt like being handed something rare. She had been 26. She had been lonely. She had been, she understood now, exactly the kind of woman a man like Theodore looked for. Someone who would be grateful enough not to ask too many questions. The engagement had lasted 11 months. 11 months of Theodore commenting on what she ate at dinner. 11 months of him suggesting, always gently at first, that she might consider walking more, eating less, presenting herself better. 11 months of standing in rooms full of his friends and feeling the particular invisibility of being the woman everyone noticed for the wrong reasons, and spoke about afterward in lowered voices. She had told herself she was being too sensitive. She had told herself this was what relationships looked like up close, that the pretty version she'd imagined as a girl was just that. Imaginary. Then came the night of the Hargrove dinner. They had arrived late because Theodore had spent 20 minutes standing in the doorway of her room explaining, with great patience, why the green dress made her look like an overstuffed settee, and she had changed into the blue one, which apparently only slightly improved matters, and they had driven the 12 minutes to the Hargrove house in silence so complete she could hear the horses breathing. The dining room held 14 people. Mabel knew 3 of them. She sat at the far end of the table from Theodore, which was where he preferred her during these evenings, close enough to be present, far enough that her contributions to conversation required effort to hear. She had been trying to follow a discussion about railroad expansion when she realized the woman to her left, a Mrs. Cora Dunning, wife of the county land assessor, had asked her something. "I'm sorry," Mabel said. "I didn't catch that." "I asked whether the wedding date had been set." Mrs. Dunning smiled the way women smile when they already know the answer and are merely enjoying the formality of the question. "Theodore mentioned spring. We haven't finalized it." "Of course." Mrs. Dunning took a small sip of wine. "I suppose there are preparations to be made." Her eyes moved briefly and deliberately from Mabel's face to her shoulders to the front of the blue dress and back. A wedding requires a good deal of planning for both parties. Across the table, another woman, younger, sharper-featured, leaned in. I think it's brave, actually, what Theodore is doing. Mabel looked at her. I'm not sure what you mean. Taking on a project. The woman said it lightly, as if commenting on weather. Some men have the patience for it. Not all. Silence settled for exactly 2 seconds, the way it does when something terrible has been said that everyone heard and no one will acknowledge. Then conversation resumed, and Mabel sat with her hands in her lap and her food going cold in front of her, and she thought, this is the rest of my life. This table. These women. This particular quality of contempt dressed up as concern. She looked down the length of the table at Theodore. He was laughing at something the man beside him had said, head thrown back, completely at ease, and he didn't look at her once. She excused herself after the soup course and didn't go back. She walked home in the dark, 3 miles in shoes that weren't made for walking, and she was so calm it frightened her. By the time she reached the 2-room house that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, she knew she was leaving. Not that night. She had no money, no plan, no destination, but soon. And somewhere Theodore Vance would not think to look, because in 11 months he had never once asked her what she wanted, which meant he did not know her well enough to predict where she would go. She spent the next 8 days making quiet preparations. She had $43 saved from the years she'd worked the counter at the Kellerman dry goods store, tucked in an envelope inside her copy of Gray's Anatomy. Theodore had never shown any interest in the book, which was one of approximately 3 things she now recognized as foresight on her part. She withdrew the money, packed what she could carry without it looking like packing, and she waited. The morning she left, Theodore had gone to the county seat on business. She wrote him a letter. It said, I am ending our engagement. Please do not look for me. I am keeping the brooch. She had retrieved the pearl brooch from his coat pocket 3 weeks earlier while he slept. She walked to the livery, paid for a horse to rent as far as Caldwell Junction, and at Caldwell Junction she asked the man behind the post office counter where a person might find work if they needed to disappear for a while. He looked at her the way people had been looking at her all her life, taking inventory, calculating, arriving at a figure lower than the asking price. Then he said, Up in the divide, maybe, if you're desperate. What's up there? Couple of trappers, mostly gone half wild. He thought for a moment. Silas Boone's got a cabin up past the Third Ridge. Runs cattle some seasons, runs furs others. Doesn't take to company, but he might take to cheap labor if you were useful enough. He paused. You'd have to climb to get there. It's not a short climb. How long? Half a day if you're fit. He looked at her again. Longer if you're not. She thanked him and bought 2 bread rolls and a wedge of hard cheese from the store attached to the post office. Then she started walking toward the mountains. The road ended about 2 miles in, which was how she knew she'd found the right path. It was the one that stopped trying to help. What replaced it was a trail, loose-packed and narrow, threading upward through stands of pine that grew thicker and darker the higher she climbed. The air changed almost immediately. Down in the valley, it had been the usual smell of late winter mud and horse and cook fires. Up here it smelled like cold stone and something green and alive under the snow, like the mountain was already thinking about spring even if it hadn't announced it yet. Mabel climbed. She was not, by anyone's measure, built for climbing. She was fully aware of this. She was aware of it in her thighs, which began burning before she'd cleared the first quarter mile. She was aware of it in her lungs, which protested with a quiet but insistent wheeze. She was aware of it in her boots, which were town boots, sensible enough for cobblestones, completely unprepared for frozen dirt and loose shale. She climbed anyway. She had learned sometime in the past few years that her body's complaints and her body's actual limits were not the same thing. The complaints came early, the limits came much later, and sometimes not at all if she was stubborn enough. Theodore had always taken the complaints as proof of the limits. He'd been wrong about a lot of things. That was one of them. She stopped twice to rest, both times because her right ankle was threatening to turn on the uneven ground rather than because she needed to catch her breath. Or that was what she told herself. And after a while it was close enough to true that it didn't matter. Around midday the trail split. There was nothing marking which branch to take, No sign, no cairn. She stood at the split for a long moment, breathing hard, the cold working its way through her coat collar. She looked left, she looked right. The left-hand trail was wider, more traveled, which probably meant it led somewhere ordinary. She took the right. An hour later, she came through a stand of old pines, and the mountain opened up into something unexpected. A clearing, wide and windswept, with a cabin set low against the rock face on the north side. Behind it, a smaller structure, a smokehouse, or a storage shed. Beyond that, a barn, unpainted, the wood gone silver with age and weather. A fence line that had been built by someone who understood fences, running in a straight, unforgiving line down toward a frozen creek. There was smoke coming from the cabin chimney. She crossed the clearing. Halfway across, the door of the cabin opened. The man who stepped out was not what she'd pictured from the postmaster's description. She'd imagined someone older, bent. The specific defeat of a man who had chosen isolation and been shaped by it. What she got was tall, very tall, with the kind of height that doesn't apologize for itself, and solid in a way that had nothing to do with vanity. He wore a heavy flannel shirt over canvas pants, suspenders, heavy boots. He had a beard that had been trimmed recently enough to suggest he wasn't entirely indifferent to its existence, and dark eyes under a heavy brow that were currently looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not hostile, not welcoming, something more neutral and more careful than either. He stood at the edge of the porch and waited for her to cover the remaining 50 feet. She did. When she stopped in front of him, she noticed she was still breathing hard from the climb, which was not ideal, but there was nothing to be done about it. She looked up at him. He had a solid 8 inches on her, and she said, "I'm looking for Silas Boone." "Found him," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, not unkind. "My name is Mabel Ashcroft. I heard you might need help." He looked at her for a long moment, not the way Theodore's friends had looked at her, cataloging, dismissing, more like someone assessing a situation they hadn't anticipated and were trying to understand. "Who told you that?" "Man at the post office in Caldwell Junction. Gerald Fitch." He didn't say his name. "Short, red-faced, talks more than anyone who works in a post office should." "That sounds right," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, more like the distant cousin of one. Then it was gone. "Gerald Fitch," he said more to himself than to her, "has been sending people up my mountain for 6 years, and I have never once thanked him for it." "Do they usually make it up?" "No," he said flatly. "Last one turned back at the second ridge. Man before that made it to the split and took the wrong trail, ended up at old Terrence Abbott's goat pen 2 miles east." He paused. "Before that was a boy from the valley who told me he was experienced with cattle." "Was he?" "He'd seen them from a distance." Silas folded his arms. "What experience do you have?" She thought about what to say and decided the truth was easier than an inventory. "I can cook, clean, repair most things that tear or break, and I learn fast. I'm not going to pretend I've worked a mountain homestead before, because I haven't." "What kind of work are you coming from?" "Dry goods store. Before that, some bookkeeping for a mill." She paused. "I can read, write, do figures." "So can I," he said, not unkindly. "That's not what this place needs." She looked past him at the cabin. From here she could see that the porch rail on the left side had cracked and been left, that the door hung slightly off true, that the window to the left of the door had a gap where the frame met the sill that someone had stuffed with what looked like an old rag. None of it catastrophic. All of it the accumulated evidence of a man who was very good at some things and didn't have enough hours in the day for everything else. "You're leaving for a hunt," she said. He looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "Your pack's just inside the door and the fire's been banked low. You bank a fire low when you're not going to be back by evening." She kept her eyes on the cabin, not on his face. "I'm guessing 2 days, maybe 3, which means you're leaving the place unattended." "I've left it unattended before." "In late winter?" A beat of silence. "What would you do with 2 days?" he asked. "Fix the porch rail, rehang that door, fill the window gap with something that isn't a rag. Start on whatever else needs doing. Have a meal ready when you got back." "And in exchange?" "A dry place to sleep," she said. and consideration. If the work's worth keeping, we talk about staying on. If it's not, I leave. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines at the edge of the clearing, a long, low sound. Somewhere below, a bird called once and went quiet. I'm not in the habit of taking on people I don't know, Silas said. Neither am I, she said. Being here is about as far outside my habits as I've ever been. He looked at her for a long moment, and she made herself hold still under it. She didn't look away, but she didn't push. She just waited, the way she'd learned to wait when the answer mattered and couldn't be rushed. There's a cot in the barn, he said finally. Blankets in the chest at the foot of it. The woodpile is behind the cabin, You'll need to bring in enough to last the night. All right. I'm back in 2 days. Maybe 3 if the weather turns. All right, she said again. He studied her face one more time, the way someone reads a map they're not entirely certain of. Then he turned, went back inside, and came out a minute later with his pack over one shoulder and his rifle in his right hand. He walked past her without stopping. 20 steps into the clearing, he turned back, just once. If you break anything, he said, leave it where it is so I know what happened. I won't break anything, she said. He looked at her for one more second. Then he turned and walked toward the tree line and disappeared into the pines without looking back again. Mabel stood alone in the middle of the clearing, surrounded by wind and silence and the enormity of what she'd just done. And for the first time in more days than she could count, she felt something loosen in her chest. Not happiness, and it was too early for that. Not relief exactly, because she had no idea whether any of this would work out. Just space. The simple fact of space. She turned and looked at the cabin with its cracked rail and crooked door and rag-stuffed window, and she took a breath of mountain air that tasted like cold pine and something clean she didn't have a name for. Then she went to find the woodpile. Stimmt. The barn was better than she'd expected. Not comfortable, Tizal. No one would call it comfortable, but solid. The roof was good. The floor was packed earth, but dry. The cot was narrow with a wool blanket that smelled like cedar and something vaguely animal, which she draped over her coat for extra warmth once the temperature dropped. She didn't sleep right away. She lay on the cot in the dark with the sounds of the mountain settling around her. Wind, the creak of the barn walls, something moving in the trees that was probably nothing. And she ran through the accounting of herself that she'd been putting off for weeks. She was 27 years old. She had $41 remaining from the 43 she'd started with, the horse rental and the bread rolls and the cheese. She had no one in the valley she could call family, no one who would be looking for her out of love rather than obligation. She had, apparently, the use of a barn cot on a mountain belonging to a man who had given her exactly zero indication of whether she was welcome past 2 or 3 days. This was not, by any reasonable measure, a stable situation. She also noticed, lying there in the dark, that for the first time in 11 months, she had not spent a single moment of the past several hours thinking about whether she was taking up too much space, whether she was too loud or too large or too much, whether the way she breathed or moved or stood was being silently catalogued by someone who found her wanting. She noticed the absence of that feeling the way you notice a sound stopping that you'd gotten so used to you forgot it was noise. Then she went to sleep. She was up before dawn. The first thing she did was look at the cabin properly, walking around all 4 sides in the gray pre-light, taking stock the way she used to take inventory at the dry goods store. Not dramatic, just methodical. What's here? What's missing? What's broken? What's urgent? The porch rail. A clean break. Not rotted. Fixable with the right piece of wood and some hardware. She'd look in the barn. The door. The lower hinge had pulled slightly from the frame on the jamb side. She needed a screwdriver and probably some strips of wood to pack the holes before reseating the screws. She'd look in the barn. The window. She'd deal with the rag gap with proper material when she found some. She'd look in the barn. There was a pattern emerging. The barn turned out to be, among other things, the place where a man who had lived alone for a long time stored the things he knew he needed but hadn't gotten around to addressing. She found lumber offcuts, a coffee tin full of mixed hardware, screws, nails, brackets, all different sizes, 2 hammers, a handsaw, 3 screwdrivers in varying states of usefulness, a pry bar, rope of several different thicknesses, and one shelf of organized supplies that told her something about Silas Boone. Not everything was chaotic. The things that mattered to him were ordered. She started on the door. It took her the better part of the morning. Her hands weren't used to this kind of work. Not the tool handling itself, which she managed, but the sustained grip, the position, the angle. Her fingers were stiff in the cold. She drove one screw at a wrong angle and had to extract it and start again, which cost her time and made her swear under her breath with a creativity she hadn't known she possessed. But the door hung true when she was done. She stood back and swung it open, swung it closed, opened it again. True, level, no drag. She pressed both hands flat against the wood for a moment, like something she needed to feel was real. Then she went to work on the porch rail. By early afternoon, she had the rail repaired. Not beautiful, but solid. And the window gaps stuffed with a proper wad of cut wool from a length of old blanket she'd found on the barn shelf. She'd built up the fire inside until the cabin was actually warm, rather than merely heated in a technical sense, and she'd found the small pantry off the main room and assessed its contents with the detached interest of someone who has spent years keeping track of what a place has and what it needs. It had dried beans in 3 varieties, cornmeal, a partial side of salt-cured pork, 2 jars of preserved tomatoes, a jar of honey, a tin of coffee, some dried fruit she couldn't quite identify, and a collection of spices that suggested someone had aspirations toward cooking that the actual circumstances of the place hadn't quite supported. She made a pot of bean soup with the pork and tomatoes, seasoned it until it was worth eating, and let it simmer. Then she found a bucket and started on the floor. The floor hadn't been thoroughly cleaned in. She didn't want to calculate how long. Not because Silas was a particularly dirty person. From what she could see, he picked things up and put them away and didn't leave food out. But there's a kind of cleaning that requires someone to get on their hands and knees and go after the corners and the edges and the places that don't get attended to in the daily course of living. And that kind of cleaning had clearly not happened in some time. She did it now. She moved the table, the chairs, the wood box. She went after every corner. Her back complained around the halfway point, and she noted the complaint and kept going. When she was done, the floor was not clean in the way of a freshly built house. It was clean in the way of something that had been reclaimed. There's a difference, and she appreciated both. She ate some of the soup standing at the stove, from the pot, because the table was still pushed to the side, and she was too tired to move it back just yet. She sat down on one of the chairs, the sturdier one, and looked at what she'd done in one day. It was not nothing. She put the table back. She brought in extra wood until the box was full. She checked the fire, banked it for the night, went back to the barn. The cold had gotten serious with the sunset. She pulled on every layer she had and wrapped the cedar-smelling blanket over all of it and lay on the narrow cot and listened to the mountain, which had settled into a deep quiet that was different from the daytime silence. Thicker, more deliberate. She thought about Theodore, briefly. The way you press a bruise to check if it still hurts. It did. Somewhat. The wound was real. But she'd climbed a mountain today, fixed a door, repaired a porch rail, cleaned a floor, made soup, and no one had commented on her size once. Not even her. She turned over on the cot and closed her eyes. Silas came back on the evening of the second day. She heard the horse before she heard him, a crunching of frozen ground through the barn wall, and she'd already had the stove restoked and the leftover soup reheated by the time she heard his boots on the porch. There was a pause, longer than it needed to be. She heard him push the door open, then nothing for a moment. Then, the door hangs straight. Left hinge was pulling, she called from where she stood at the stove. Packed the holes before I reset the screws. Another pause. She heard him moving around the main room, unhurried. She heard the sound of him stopping by the window, then by the porch rail. The boards creaked under him as he stepped outside, and she imagined him putting his hand on the newly repaired section and testing it. He came back inside. He stood in the doorway between the main room and where she was standing, and he looked at her with that same careful, neutral expression he'd had at first meeting. His coat and hair were damp with a mix of sweat and the day's cold. He'd gotten something on the hunt. She could see it in the way he held himself, something satisfied underneath the tired. You ate, he said. It wasn't an accusation. The soup I made. I can make more if what you see in the pot isn't enough. He was quiet for a moment. You made soup. You had beans and salt pork and preserved tomatoes. The combination works. He crossed to the stove, looked at the pot, and without ceremony picked up a spoon from the hook beside the stove and tasted it. He was quiet. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something in the set of his jaw shifted. A small release. That's good, he said. Thank you. Ted. He hung his coat by the door, sat down at the table in the chair she'd come to think of as his. It faced the door, the way the chairs of cautious men always do. And she ladled soup into the bowl she'd had waiting and set it in front of him. He ate. She sat across from him because standing felt stranger than sitting, and she had soup of her own. It was quiet between them, but it was not uncomfortable. She would have expected it to be uncomfortable. She'd braced for it, but there was something in the way Silas occupied a room, low-key, self-contained, not taking up more space than he needed, that made the quiet feel like something chosen rather than imposed. Halfway through the bowl, he said without looking up, "Floors." "Last done probably last spring," she said. "Corners especially." He didn't argue. He ate 3 more spoonfuls, then, "The wood box. Brought enough in for 2 days." "I can see that." Another stretch of quiet. "There's a list," he said finally, "in my head. Things that need doing. Long list." "I figured," she said. He looked up at her then, directly. He had a way of looking at people, and at her anyway, that felt like he was trying to read past the surface into something underneath. Not in a cruel way, not in the cataloging way of Theodore's acquaintances, but like he was genuinely trying to understand something and was patient enough to wait until he did. "You're planning to stay," he said. "I'd like to, if the work's worth keeping." "I said I'd consider it." "And?" He set his spoon down. He looked at the bowl, then at the table, then at her. "1 month?" he said. "We try it 1 month. If it works, and if you decide you can stand the mountain, we talk about longer." Something in her chest settled the way a plank settles into the right groove. 1 month, she said. "Yes." He nodded. He picked up his spoon and finished the soup. Outside the cabin, the mountain was going about its business. Wind in the high pines, the freeze deepening toward full night, something distant and wild calling once from somewhere far above the tree line. Mabel refilled his bowl without being asked. He didn't thank her, but when she sat back down, he pushed the bread she'd made that morning across the table toward her side, wordlessly, like it was just something that needed to happen. She pulled off a piece and ate it. The fire worked steadily in the stove. The soup was warm, the door hung true. She was on a mountain she'd never been to before, at a table with a man she barely knew, having arrived here as the result of a series of choices that no one who knew her would have predicted. And she thought, sitting there with bread in her hand and soup in her bowl, and the sound of wind outside, and the sound of a man eating across from her, that she could not remember the last time a situation had felt exactly as large as it needed to be, and no larger. She didn't say any of that. She ate her bread and watched the fire through the grate of the stove, and the night settled in around the cabin. And for the first time since she could clearly remember, nobody was asking her to be less than she was. The month had no official start date. Neither of them marked it. It simply began the morning after Silas came back from the hunt, when Mabel woke before dawn in the barn and lay there for exactly 40 seconds deciding whether the ache in her lower back from the cot was bad enough to matter, decided it wasn't, and got up. That was how most things happened between them in those early days. Not by agreement, not by announcement, but by the accumulated weight of small decisions that nobody commented on. She learned his rhythms quickly, the way you learn the rhythms of a place you're trying to fit into without breaking anything. He rose early, earlier than her the first week, which she corrected by the second. He drank his coffee black and didn't want conversation with it. Not because he was hostile, but because morning was clearly a time he used for thinking, and he thought the way he did most things, quietly, without narrating the process. He ate whatever was in front of him without complaint, which she appreciated. And he cleaned up after himself without being asked, which she appreciated more. He worked from first light until the light was gone, and sometimes after. She understood that the mountain required it. There was always something: fence line down, animal to tend, wood to cut, trap to check, a dozen other tasks that she was still learning to recognize as urgent before they became crises. She started a list on the third day. Not a formal list. She found a pencil stub in a scrap of brown paper bag, and she wrote things down as she noticed them, the way she used to inventory the dry goods store. Loose board on the north side of the barn. Water trough, developing a split along the bottom seam. Smokehouse door latch worn to the point of nearly not catching. She pinned the list to the inside of the barn door, where she slept, and added to it every day. On the fifth day, Silas saw it. He'd come to the barn to check on one of the horses. The older one, a gray mare named Nothing that he apparently called Nothing at all, just talked to in a low voice when he needed to, which she found unexpectedly human. And he stopped at the door and read the list without touching it. She was across the barn shaking out the blanket from her cot, which produced a remarkable quantity of dust and animal hair, and she watched him read it and waited to see what he'd say. "The trough," he said, still looking at the list. "I've been meaning to fix that since fall. The seam's not bad yet. Another week before it starts losing water. What are you planning to use?" "Found pitch in the corner shelf. I'd need to dry the wood around the seam first, then fill it. Probably hold the season." He turned from the list then and looked at her with that measuring look she was getting used to. "Where'd you learn that?" "I didn't," she said. "I read it in a book about timber maintenance that was sitting on your shelf in there." She nodded toward the cabin. "The one with the brown cover." He was quiet for a moment. "That book's been there 4 years." "It's a good book," she said. "Practical." Something moved in his expression that she almost missed. It was brief, just a fraction of a second, and she couldn't have said exactly what it was. Recognition, maybe, or recalibration. He turned back to the mare, checked her left foreleg, which he'd been watching for swelling since before Mabel arrived, and said, without turning around, "The pitch is in the tin with the red lid, not the black one. Black one's for leather." "I'll remember that," she said. She fixed the trough that afternoon. It took longer than she'd estimated, and she got pitch on her left sleeve and couldn't fully get it out, which annoyed her at a low, persistent level. But the seam held, and when she ran water into the trough and watched it not drain away through the bottom, the satisfaction of it was entirely out of proportion to the size of the task, and she didn't try to explain that to herself. The work was harder on her body than she let show. This was not a decision she made consciously. It was more that Mabel had spent enough years around people who watched her physical limitations with a particular quality of attention, waiting for them, almost, cataloging them as evidence of something they'd already decided. That she had developed a reflex against displaying effort, against being seen to struggle. She paid for it at the end of the day sometimes. There were nights she went back to the barn cot, and her shoulders wouldn't unknot properly, and her hands were stiff, and the climb from the creek with the water buckets had done something to her right knee that she was monitoring the way you monitor a small fire and hoping it doesn't spread. She didn't mention any of it. What she did instead was learn. She paid attention to how Silas moved through the work, the angles he used, the tools, the way he distributed weight and effort so the task worked for him rather than against him. He was efficient in a way that had nothing to do with speed. It was the efficiency of someone who had done difficult physical work for long enough that they'd worked out, through trial and mostly error, how to do it without wrecking themselves. She started adapting what she observed, changed the way she carried the water buckets, 2 trips with a balanced load instead of 1 unbalanced one, used the pry bar more and her own lifting less. Let the tools do what the tools were designed for rather than supplementing with her body when the tool wasn't quite working, which was usually a sign that the tool was wrong for the task, not that she needed to push harder. Her hands stopped being sore in the same places and started being sore in different places, which she took as evidence of progress. On the 8th day, she baked bread. This sounds like a small thing written down that way. It was not a small thing. It was the first time since she'd arrived that she'd used the cabin oven for something beyond reheating, and she'd had to take it slowly because the oven ran hot on the left side. She discovered this by testing it with a small test piece of dough first, which she'd learned from her mother and which had saved her more than once. She adjusted. She baked a full loaf and a smaller second one with the remaining dough, flavored with a pinch of dried rosemary she'd found in the spice collection. She left both on the table before Silas came in from the afternoon's work. He came in, took off his coat, washed his hands at the basin, and stopped at the table. He looked at the bread. Then he looked around the room, at her, standing by the stove, with an expression that she couldn't quite read the center of. "You baked," he said. "Oven runs hot on the left. You should know that." "I know that," he said. "I've burned things in it. The rosemary is from your shelf. I should have asked first." "You don't have to ask about rosemary," he said, a little roughly, and she realized this might be the closest he came to saying you're allowed to use what's here. He sat down and cut into the loaf and ate standing at the table, which was apparently what he did when he was hungry and didn't want to wait. And she watched him eat and felt something complicated and warm settle in her chest and made no comment about it to anyone. The second week brought the first real problem. It wasn't dramatic. Problems on a mountain homestead rarely were, she was learning. They were usually quiet and practical and had been developing for a while before they announced themselves. This one was the fence on the eastern pasture, which had given up in 3 places over a section of about 30 feet, the posts rotted at the base, and the wire gone slack in that particular loose-jawed way that means something has been leaning on it repeatedly from one side. Cattle. Silas had 6 head wintered in the lower pasture, and 3 of them had developed the habit of testing the eastern fence. She found out about the fence the way she found out about most things at the homestead, by going to look at something she'd noticed and finding something else that needed attention. She'd gone down to check the water level in the creek where they drew domestic water, and on the way back she'd taken the path along the eastern pasture edge, and there it was. She stood looking at it for a while, assessing. Then she went back to the cabin. Silas was splitting wood behind the cabin. She waited until he set down the maul between swings and said, "Eastern fence." He straightened and looked at her. 3 sections, maybe 30 feet total. Posts are gone at the base. The wire's repairable, but the posts need replacing. She paused. "I can do the wire. The posts need 2 people or a different approach than I've got." He picked up the maul again and looked at the wood he was splitting. For a moment she thought he was going to say nothing and just go look himself, which would have been fine. Instead he said, "How'd you find it?" "Took the east path back from the creek." "Why?" She considered this. "I like knowing what's there." He put the maul down again, differently this time, more final. "All right," he said, We'll look at it tomorrow. I want to finish the wood today." He paused. "You can work the wire if you know wire work. I'll deal with the posts." "I don't know wire work," she said. "I've never done it, but I can learn it while you do the posts if you show me the tool and the technique." He looked at her again with that steady, measuring look. She was getting better at not fidgeting under it. "That's honest," he said, and picked up the maul and went back to splitting, and that was apparently the end of the conversation. She worked the fence wire the next morning while Silas replaced posts. He showed her the tool, a wire stretcher, and the technique, and how tight was tight enough and how you could over-tighten and cause a different problem. And then he went to work on the posts and let her do it, which was the best kind of teaching. "Here's what you need. Now try it. I'm close enough to catch the mistake if it's bad." She made 2 mistakes, both small. She corrected them herself before he looked up. By noon, the fence was repaired. Not beautifully. Her section of wire was tighter in some places than others, and she'd need to come back and even it out. But it was holding. She stood at the fence line and rubbed the cramp out of her right hand and looked at the 30 feet they'd put back together and felt that same disproportionate satisfaction she'd felt with the water trough. Silas came to stand beside her, not close, the way he positioned himself generally, near enough to be part of whatever was happening, with enough space to be separate from it. "Not bad," he said. "It's uneven in the middle section. It'll hold." "I know it'll hold. It's still uneven." He glanced sideways at her, and she caught the edge of something on his face. Not a smile exactly, but the structural preparation for one, the slight change in the muscles around his mouth before the expression decides what it's going to be. "You're harder on your own work than I am," he said. "I have more reason to be," she said. "You've been doing this for years. I've been doing it for a week and a half." 9 days, he said. She looked at him. "You're counting." He looked back at the fence. "I said 1 month." I'm keeping track of the month." She turned back to the fence, too. "Fair enough," she said. They walked back to the cabin separately, which was how they usually did it. Not because of any particular tension, but because they'd both turned out to be people who needed the walk to think. Ted. On the 12th day, she hurt her knee properly. She'd been carrying a load of milled boards from the barn to the north side of the cabin where she'd decided to tackle the loose board she'd put on the list. The ground between the barn and the cabin was uneven at one point, a slight dip that collected water and then ice. And she'd known it was there and been careful about it, and she was careful about it this time too, but the careful wasn't quite enough, and her right foot caught the edge of the icy patch at a bad angle, and the knee twisted before she could stop it. She didn't fall. That was something. She caught herself on the boards, drove a splinter into her left palm in the process, and stood very still for a long moment while the knee registered its complaint in specific and persuasive terms. Then she moved carefully to the north side of the cabin and put the boards down and stood with her hand on the cabin wall and breathed through it. It wasn't the worst pain she'd been in. It wasn't anywhere near that. But it was the kind of pain that had a message in it, and the message was, this isn't going to be silent about itself the way things have been silent so far. She went back to the icy patch and broke it up with the heel of her boot, which she should have done days ago, and which she was annoyed at herself for not having done. Then she went to the barn, found the cloth she used for cleaning, wet a piece of it at the water barrel, and wrapped the knee firmly before going back to the cabin boards. She worked slower the rest of the afternoon. The knee allowed it if she didn't push. She was rehanging the loose board. 3 of the nails had completely given up their grip in the rotting wood of the original backing, which meant digging out the bad wood and setting new backing before re-nailing, when she heard Silas come around the corner of the cabin. He stopped. She didn't stop working. "You're favoring your right leg," he said. "I twisted the knee a little this morning. It's fine." "How little?" "Little enough," she said, and set another nail. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him move, not away but closer. He crouched down beside her, which put him close enough that she was very aware of the fact that he was there, and he looked at the wrapped knee and then at the board she was working on. "Ice patch by the barn," she said, before he could ask. "I broke it up." "The corner of it reforms. I chop it every few days." "I know that now," she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Does it need looking at?" "It's wrapped. It'll be stiff tomorrow and then better." "You sound sure about that." "I've twisted this knee before. I know how it behaves." He stood up slowly, looking at the board she'd been working on. He studied the way she dug out the rotted wood and set the new backing. He didn't comment on it, which she was coming to understand was how he gave something positive marks. Not by saying so, but by saying nothing negative and moving on. "Supper in an hour," she said. He went back around the corner of the cabin. A few minutes later, she heard the sound of the axe from the direction of the ice patch, sharp and rhythmic, breaking up more than just the corner. She didn't say thank you because she hadn't asked him to, but she acknowledged it in some interior place that was keeping track of these moments. The extra blanket he'd left on the end of the cot in the barn 3 days in without mentioning it, the easier route he'd started taking past the barn when she was working the water that happened to put him in position to take one of the heavy buckets without making anything of it, the way he'd fixed the barn door latch when she wasn't there so she didn't have to wrestle it in the cold. Small things. Not nothing. Tut. The 3rd week the weather went difficult. Not a storm. Not yet. But the temperature dropped significantly, and the wind picked up from the north and brought with it a damp that got into everything, the kind of cold that isn't satisfied with being cold and wants to be wet too. The kind that made the work slower because everything was slightly harder. Wood didn't split as cleanly, latches needed more persuasion, fingers went numb faster. Mabel got up one morning and her breath hung in the air inside the barn. That was new. She dressed in everything she had, which was several layers, and went to start the stove in the cabin before Silas was up. She'd been doing this for 2 weeks, getting the cabin warm before he came in for coffee, not because he'd asked, but because it was efficient. He came in from tending the horses and the coffee was ready and the cabin was warm and they could both start their day without the specific misery of waiting for a cold room to decide to cooperate. He was already up this morning, though. She came through the cabin door and he was at the stove, just starting the fire, and he looked up when she came in. "Temperature dropped in the night," he said. "I noticed. It was in the barn, too." He looked at her for a moment. "You slept in the barn last night." I sleep in the barn every night. The temperature was below freezing in the barn last night. I was aware of that. You should sleep inside, he said. It came out flatly, as a statement of what should be, not an offer or a question. She looked at him. There's only the one room. There's the storeroom off the back. He went back to building the fire. It's small. I use it for supplies, but I can move them. It's got 4 walls and a roof and shares the stove wall, which means it'll be warmer than the barn. She considered this. There were a number of things she could have said. She chose, if it's not too much trouble to move the supplies. It's not, he said, and that was settled. She helped him move the supplies from the storeroom that morning. It took an hour. The storeroom was, as advertised, small, barely enough for the cot and a narrow shelf. But it shared the thick interior wall with the stove, and by midday it was noticeably warmer than the barn, and that night she slept without waking at 3 in the morning because the temperature had dropped again. Something shifted after that, small but real. She was inside the cabin now, even if in a separate room. The mornings started differently. She'd hear him before she saw him, the specific sounds of him moving around the main room, the stove, the coffee. He'd hear her come out of the storeroom. They'd intersect at the stove with the coffee and the day's work, and neither of them made any remark about the fact that the arrangement was more domestic than either of them had signed up for. She became more careful about her things in the main room. He became, she noticed, more careful about his. One morning, the 18th day by her count, though she'd stopped thinking of it as a count, she came out of the storeroom to find a pair of heavier work boots sitting beside the stove. She stopped. They were used, not old, but broken in, clearly belonging to someone at some point. They were not her size, but they were closer than what she had, and they'd been left there with the tongues folded down to let the leather loosen. Silas was outside already. She could hear him with the horses. She looked at the boots for a long moment. They were practical. Her town boots had been struggling. She'd reinforced the right sole twice already with materials from the barn, and while the reinforcing held, they were not boots made for this terrain in this weather. She sat down and tried the left one on over her thick wool sock. Too wide. She could feel the extra room. She went to the supply chest where she'd reorganized the extra cloth and cut 2 thick strips and layered them inside and tried again. Better. Not perfect. They'd rub at the heel. But between the cloth and the thick sock, it would be manageable. She put them both on and stood up and walked across the cabin floor and back. Manageable was an improvement on what she'd had. She went outside. Silas was coming out of the barn. He glanced down at her feet and then up at her face, and then he looked somewhere past her left shoulder, which was apparently where he looked when he was declining to make a thing into a thing. "They'll need something inside to fit properly," he said, looking at the neutral middle distance. "I've sorted that," she said. "All right," he said, and walked past her toward the tool shed, and that was that. She stood there for a moment with the borrowed boots on her feet and the cold wind coming off the mountain, and the sky doing something complicated and gray above the tree line, and she thought that she had not had someone make a quiet, practical gesture on her behalf without wanting something in return in a very long time. Maybe never, actually, if she was going to be honest about it. She didn't have time to stand there thinking about it. The fence on the north pasture needed checking, and the smokehouse door latch wasn't going to fix itself, and there was a full list of things that needed doing before the weather got worse. She turned and got to work. 22 days in, she made a mistake with the smokehouse. She had been working on the latch mechanism. The worn part was a small iron catch, and she'd found what she thought was a matching piece in the hardware tin. And she'd been so focused on fitting the new catch that she hadn't fully paid attention to the fact that the smokehouse fire had been running while she worked, and at some point she'd left the door propped open too long, adjusting the latch hardware, and the temperature inside dropped enough to threaten the curing process on the meat hanging inside. She caught it in time, just in time, came back from the hardware tin with the right size catch, and saw the smoke thin and pale, and knew immediately what had happened and got the door closed and the fire restoked. She stood inside the smokehouse in the smoke and checked the meat one by one and found no damage and let out a breath that had been very much held. Then she went to find Silas and told him what had happened, because if something had gone wrong with the cured meat, that was not a small thing, and he needed to know. He was at the back of the barn, and he listened to her tell it without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he said, "And?" "No damage. I got the door closed and the fire up in time, but I should have been more careful about the sequence." He was quiet for a moment. Anyone who's worked a smokehouse has done that. "That doesn't make it not a mistake." "No," he said, "it doesn't." He said it simply, not unkindly, not making more of it than it was, but not erasing it either. "How's the latch now?" "Fitted and working, better than before. The new catch sits deeper in the strike." He nodded. "Then it's done." She thought he'd go back to what he was doing, but he didn't immediately. He stayed where he was for a moment and looked at her, not with the measuring look of the early days, but something slightly different. Less assessment. More, she wasn't sure. Less distance in it, somehow. "You've been here 22 days, he said. "I know." "The list you put on the barn door. The one from the first week. What about it?" "Most of it's done," he said. She'd noticed that too. She hadn't said anything about it. "There's still the north pasture drainage and the roof on the tool shed. Those are bigger jobs. Need better weather." "I know." She paused. "I've been working on a second list." He looked at her for a moment. "Of course you have," he said. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. It was too dry to be warmth and too genuine to be anything else. She went back to the cabin to check on what was simmering for supper, and she did not examine the expression on his face when he'd said that too closely, because some things were too new and fragile to hold up to direct examination, and she had learned by now that the mountain had its own ideas about timing, and the best thing she could do was not get ahead of it. The 23rd day she got up and built the fire and made the coffee, and when Silas came in from the horses, he sat at the table and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the window at the weather, which was threatening, and said, "Storm's coming." "How soon?" 2, maybe 3 days. She sat down across from him with her own cup and looked at where he was looking, at the mountain outside the window, going about the business of preparing to be inhospitable. She thought about the fence and the smokehouse and the tool shed roof and the drainage work and everything on the second list that wasn't done yet. "What needs to be done before it hits?" she asked. He looked at her then, directly, over the rim of his coffee mug. Something in his expression was open in a way it hadn't been on the first day, or the 5th, or even the 15th. Not soft. Silas Boone was not and probably never had been soft, but open. Unlocked might be a better word, like a door left slightly ajar by someone who hadn't decided yet whether to open it all the way. "A lot," he said. "Then we should make a list," she said. And something that had been trying to become a smile finally made it all the way there, brief and a little crooked and real, and he said, "You have one already, don't you?" She reached into her apron pocket and put the second piece of brown paper on the table between them. He picked it up. He read it. He set it back down and picked up his coffee and said, "You missed the chimney cap on the smokehouse." "I didn't miss it. I put it at the bottom because it's the least urgent. In a storm, it's the most urgent." She reached out and took the paper back and moved the chimney cap to the top. He watched her do it. "All right, Des," he said. "Let's get started." Outside, the mountain was making its preparations. The wind had a specific sound it got when something serious was building, lower, more even, like an intake of breath that hadn't finished yet. She'd been here 23 days and she already knew that sound. She folded the list and put it back in her pocket, and they both stood up, and the morning's work began. They spent the 2 days before the storm working in a way that felt different from the previous 3 weeks. Before, they'd been working alongside each other, parallel, coordinated, but separate. Two people in the same space with the same general goal but distinct orbits. What happened in those 2 pre-storm days was something else. It was the difference between 2 people walking in the same direction and 2 people pulling the same rope. Mabel's list had 8 items. They moved through them in order of urgency, which meant the chimney cap on the smokehouse first. Silas had been right about that. She acknowledged it once and didn't belabor it. And then reinforcing the barn door against wind load, then checking every fence line within reach of the cabin for weak points that a storm could exploit. Then bringing in enough wood to last a week because 2 days' worth would be wrong if the storm ran longer than expected, which Silas said it might. "How bad?" she asked, on the afternoon of the first day, while they were stacking wood under the lean-to at the cabin's east wall. Bad enough, he said. I've seen storms up here that lasted 4 days, seen one go 6. What do you do when it runs 6 days? Stay inside. Keep the fire. Wait. He set a log and reached for another. It's not complicated, it's just long. She thought about 6 days inside the cabin with the small storeroom and the single main room and the stove that would need feeding constantly. 6 days of the mountain being serious about itself in the way mountains got serious when they decided to. She'd been here 23 days. She had no real idea yet what the mountain looked like when it was angry. Have you ever been caught out in one? She asked, away from the cabin. He paused. Once, he said. East Ridge. I was checking a trap line, and the weather turned faster than I'd read it. He set the log. Made a shelter in the rocks. 3 days. 3 days in the rocks in a blizzard. I had enough, he said, which she was learning was his way of closing a subject that had gotten close enough to something personal. She let it close. They went back to stacking. That evening she made a pot of stew with the last of the fresh vegetables. She'd found a root cellar under the cabin that first week, which she'd been working through methodically, and what was left was carrots and 2 parsnips that were at the outer edge of their usefulness, and added dried beef and barley and whatever else seemed right, and the result was dense and warm, and they ate it at the table while the wind outside did preliminary work on what was coming. Silas ate and looked at the window, and she watched him read the weather through glass the way she supposed you learned to do after years of the mountain telling you things through the particular behavior of wind and sky. Tomorrow afternoon, he said. The storm? It'll start by afternoon. Morning, we finish what we can. She looked at the window too, though she couldn't read what he was reading. The sky was dark and the wind moved through the pines in long waves that sounded. She hadn't had a word for it before, but she had one now. Patient. Like something that knew it had all the time it needed. Silas, she said. He looked at her. The month's almost up. She said it evenly, not making it into a question yet. He looked at her for a moment. I know. I don't need an answer tonight, but I want you to know I'd like to stay. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer that night regardless. Then he said, You've been useful. I know I've been useful, she said. That's not what I asked. Another silence, different in texture. He turned his coffee mug in a slow half circle on the table, something she'd noticed he did when he was thinking about how to say something accurately. You can stay, he said, past the month, if that's what you want. It is. All right. She looked back at the window. All right, she said. They finished the stew and she cleaned up and they went to their respective rooms and the wind kept doing its patient preliminary work outside and Mabel lay on the cot in the small storeroom with the warmth of the shared wall at her back and thought that this was what it felt like when something became real instead of provisional. It felt, she decided, like the door hanging true after she'd fixed the hinge. Solid in a way it hadn't been. Settled. The storm came at noon the next day, not afternoon. The sky had been doing something wrong all morning, a yellow-gray quality to the light that she hadn't seen before but Silas recognized. He'd said at breakfast, before noon, and she'd moved the timeline in her head and they'd worked faster through the morning. They got the last of the urgent items done. The tool shed door braced from the inside, the stock moved into the enclosed section of the barn, the water barrel under the lean-to covered with boards and weighted, and they were inside the cabin with 10 minutes to spare before the first real wind hit. She knew it was the first real wind because the cabin, which had been solid and immovable under the preliminary winds of the past 2 days, shuddered. It was brief. The shudder lasted maybe a second and a half. Then the cabin settled back into itself and the wind kept going and the snow started, and she stood at the window and watched the clearing outside go white in a way that was different from snowfall. This wasn't falling. It was moving horizontally, driven, purposeful, a snow that had somewhere to be. Stay back from the windows, Silas said. Why? Glass is old. The leading gets weak. He said it from the stove where he was already adding wood. If a bad gust hits one at the wrong angle, it can crack. She stepped back from the window. Has it happened? The north window, 2 winters ago. He set the stove door. I boarded it temporarily from outside in the storm and replaced the glass in spring. Not an experience I'd recommend. She looked at the north window from where she was standing. It was whole, currently. New glass, she could tell, looking at the slightly different quality of the light through it compared to the others.
"What do you need me to do?" she asked. "For now?" He sat down in his chair by the fire. "Nothing. It's a storm. You wait it out." She looked at him. The idea of sitting and doing nothing while a storm raged outside and there might be things that needed attention was not natural to her, and he must have read that in her face because he said, "There'll be things to do, not yet. Right now the storm needs to settle into what it is before we know what it wants from us." She sat down in the other chair. It had become hers by accumulation, without announcement, and she picked up the sock she'd been darning in the evenings, and she worked on it, and the storm outside expressed itself in increasingly serious terms, and the fire in the stove worked steadily against it. They stayed like that for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable. The storm filled the silence differently than silence usually did, gave it texture, made it feel intentional, two people in a warm room while the weather outside insisted on itself. "Tell me about Before the Mountain," she said. He looked at her. "What do you want to know?" "Anything you're willing to say." He was quiet, looking at the stove. "I had a farm, lower down, in the valley east of Caldwell. Good land, good water. I worked it 10 years. What happened to it?" "I sold it." "Why?" He turned his coffee mug in that half circle again. "My wife died," he said. "Then it didn't feel like the same place anymore." She stopped darning and looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the stove, at the fire through the grate. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it simply, without adding anything. It was a long time ago. He said it the way people say things that are true and also insufficient as comfort. 7 years. I came up here because I knew someone who'd built this cabin and wasn't using it anymore, and I wanted somewhere that didn't know me from before." He paused. "The mountain doesn't know you from before. That's useful sometimes." She thought about that. She thought about coming up this mountain herself for not entirely dissimilar reasons, though the scales were different. "Her name was Clara," he said, quietly, not looking anywhere she could read. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. She picked up the sock and went back to darning, and he looked at the stove, and the storm worked on the cabin, and the fire worked back, and that was enough. After a while he said, "The man you were running from." She stilled for just a second. "Yes." "He hurt you." It wasn't a question, but she answered it. "Not in ways anyone would have seen," she said. "Nothing you could point to." She kept her eyes on the sock. "Just the steady kind. The kind where you wake up one morning and realize you can't remember the last time you felt like a person rather than a problem someone was managing." He was quiet. "I was going to marry him," she said. "I'd made myself believe it was enough. That it was what was available to me." She paused. "People told me I should be grateful. A man of his standing, interested in me. And I was grateful. For a while." "What changed?" "He took my mother's brooch." She looked up from the sock. "To keep it," he said. "For safekeeping. My mother had left it to me, and it was the only thing of hers I had." She looked back down. "I let him take it, and I stood there and I didn't say a word, and I went home, and I sat in the kitchen for 3 hours trying to figure out why I hadn't said anything. And I realized it was because I'd been trained not to. He'd spent 11 months training me not to." She pulled the thread through. "I got it back while he slept. Then I left." "Good," Silas said. Just that word. She looked at him. He was looking at her directly, and the expression on his face was one she didn't have a name for yet but would think about afterward. It was not pity. She had received enough pity to know what it looked like, and it didn't look like that. It was something more even, more solid. The expression of someone who had heard a thing accurately and recognized it for what it was. "Good," he said again, quieter, and looked back at the stove. Outside, the storm announced a new level of itself, and the cabin took it without complaint. They were inside for 2 full days. The storm wasn't 6 days. It was 2 days and most of a third morning. But those 2 days were serious. Wind that found the gaps she hadn't found yet and came through them as thin, cold threads.
Snow that had long since stopped falling and was purely moving, horizontal, grinding. Sounds from outside that she couldn't identify and found herself not asking about, because some sounds on a mountain during a blizzard are better left unexamined. She cooked because cooking was useful and because it gave her hands something to do. She made bread on the second day partly because they needed it, and partly because the process of making bread, the particular physical engagement of it, the mixing and the working and the waiting, was one of the better things she knew of for managing the specific restlessness of being confined. On the afternoon of the second day, Silas stood up from his chair with a particular suddenness that made her look up from the pot she was tending. "I need to check the smokehouse," he said. He was already reaching for his coat. "In this?" "The chimney cap. If it's shifted in the wind and the smoke's backing up in there, we can lose the meat." She looked at the window, which showed nothing but moving white. "How bad is it out there right now?" "Bad." He was buttoning his coat. "I'll be 10 minutes. The smokehouse is 30 feet from the cabin." "I know where it is," he said, but not harshly. She watched him wrap his scarf and pull on his heavy gloves, and she said, "I should come." "You don't need to. 2 people can correct a chimney cap faster than 1, and if something happens out there—" She stopped. In a whiteout 30 feet is enough distance. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached past her to the hook by the door and handed her her own coat. "Stay close," he said. The door opened and the storm came in. It wasn't like opening a door onto winter. It was like the winter had been waiting right there and stepped through. The cold was immediate and total, the wind a physical pressure rather than just movement of air, and the snow, what she could see of it, was doing exactly what she'd observed through the window, moving sideways with complete conviction. She pushed out behind him and pulled the door closed, and she could not see the smokehouse. She could barely see Silas, and he was 2 feet ahead of her. "Rope," he said, loudly, over the wind. He was already holding one end of a line she hadn't noticed him tie to the porch post. "Don't let go of this." They moved toward the smokehouse with the rope running through their hands, and 30 feet had never been so long in her life. She found the smokehouse wall before she found the door, ran her hand along it to the door, got it open against the wind, which required both of them, and they were inside. The smoke was fine. The chimney cap had held. She stood in the smokehouse while her eyes adjusted to the dim, and her body registered the relative shelter of 4 walls and a roof, and she breathed, and she said, "Cap's fine." "I can see that," Silas said. He was looking up at it. "Good call checking anyway," she said. "I know." He wasn't looking at her. He was still looking at the cap, then at the meat hanging in its rows, checking the color, the texture, the things she was only beginning to know how to read. His hands moved to one piece, testing it, then another. She watched him work and saw in the concentration of his face a man who was very good at caring for things, quietly, without ceremony. Who did it because the things needed caring for, and someone had to do it. He'd been alone up here for 7 years. 7 years of doing it all by himself, all these small acts of maintenance and care, with no one to share the checking or the carrying or the seeing. She didn't say any of that. She wasn't going to say any of it, at least not now, but she thought it. "Meat's good," he said. "Let's go back." Getting back was harder than going out because the wind had shifted slightly and was now coming at them from an angle rather than head-on, which was in some ways worse. She kept one hand on the rope and one arm up in front of her face, and she moved by feel more than sight. She lost the rope. It was a second, less than a second, the line slipping through her gloved hand in a gust that hit harder than the others, and she had one moment of pure animal awareness in which she knew the cabin was somewhere in the white ahead of her, but she could not determine in which direction, and the cold was very complete and very serious. Then her hand found the rope again, or the rope found her hand, she couldn't tell which, and she gripped it and moved, and the porch materialized out of the white like something decided to exist, and she got her hand on the porch rail and got herself up the step and inside. Silas was already inside. He turned when she came through the door, and his face, his expression, was not the neutral, careful look of the past weeks. It was something rawer than that. His eyes went from her face to her hands to her face again and back. "You slipped the rope," he said. "For a second." "I know." A pause. I felt it go slack. She was pulling off her gloves, her fingers already aching with the returning warmth. I got it back. I know you did. He didn't look away from her. But if you hadn't, I did, she said. He looked at her for one more second, and then he turned away and started on his own coat buttons, and she turned to hang up her things, and neither of them said anything else about it. But the feeling in the room was different. There was something in the air that the cold had stripped whatever usual cover it traveled under. On the third morning, the storm broke. Not gradually. The mountain didn't do gradual. It broke the way it had arrived, with decision, the wind dropping in under an hour from sustained ferocity to intermittent gusts to something manageable. The snow stopped. The sky went from that grinding gray-white to a pale flat blue, washed clean. The specific blue that only happens after a storm has taken everything unnecessary out of the air. Mabel stood on the porch in the first quiet and looked at the clearing. The snow was 4 feet in the open. The drifts against the north side of the cabin were up to the window ledge. The fence line had new work to do, and she could see from here that one section near the tree line had gone down under snow weight. Behind her, Silas came out and stood beside her. They looked at it together. North fence section, she said. I see it. Smokehouse cap held. Yes. Barn door? I'll check. She looked at the tool shed. The brace had held. The roof had accumulated a serious load of snow that needed to come off before the weight became a problem, but the structure had held. Her list from 3 days ago was in her apron pocket. She reached in and felt the paper without taking it out. We should dig the paths first, she said, before anything else. Yes, he said. She went to get the shovel from inside the door. When she came back, he was already in the snow with his own, digging toward the barn, and she started on the path toward the smokehouse, and the work was hard and cold and completely clear in its purpose, and she dug steadily, and her shoulders told her about it and she ignored them. It took 3 hours to open all the paths. They worked without talking much, in the focused way of people who know what they're doing and have too much of it to spend words on. The barn was fine. The horses were fine. The stock had weathered it without notable distress, which Silas seemed to take as due rather than fortunate, and she was starting to understand that this was correct. The preparation before the storm was the thing, and if the preparation was right, the stock being fine was not luck but consequence. They checked the north fence section together, waded through 4 feet of snow to get to it, and found it manageable. 3 posts had leaned but not snapped. The wire still attached, the section repairable before the snow settled and froze hard around it. Tomorrow, he said. Today if the temperature holds. He looked at the sky, making that calculation she couldn't make yet. It'll hold until afternoon. We can get the posts reset this morning. I'll get the tools. She was turning back through the snow toward the cabin when she heard it. A sound from the south side of the homestead, outside the cleared area, from the direction of the old pine stand that ran along the property's lower edge. A crack. Then a deeper, longer sound, like something very large deciding to stop being where it was. They both turned. The pine was big. She could see that much in the moment before it moved. Old 40 feet or more, with the heavy snow load on every branch, and whatever was holding its root system in the frozen ground had let go, and it was coming down, and it was coming down toward the smokehouse. Silas was already moving, which meant running in 4-foot snow, which meant he was not moving fast. She was moving too, without deciding to, because he was between her and the falling tree, and she saw in the next second that the trajectory was not the smokehouse. The tree was going right, going toward the south side of the cabin, going toward Silas. She shouted something. She didn't know what. The tree came down. The sound was enormous. Snow and branches and the deep percussion of a trunk that size hitting the ground, and snow erupting in a white cloud from the impact, and then a horrible secondary sound, lower, a sound that wasn't wood. She moved through the snow as fast as she'd ever moved through anything. She was not fast. She knew she was not fast, and she moved as fast as she could regardless. And when the snow cloud settled, she saw the tree on the ground, and she saw Silas, and her stomach turned completely over. He was down. Not under the trunk. The trunk had hit the ground 2 feet to his left, which was the thing that had saved him. But a heavy side branch, thick as her forearm, had caught him across the back of the legs when the tree came down, and he was face down in the snow with the branch across him. Silas. She was there beside him, on her knees in the snow. Silas, talk to me. A sound. Not words, but a sound, which was the most important thing. Don't move, she said. I need to see where you are before you move. She got her hands on the branch. It was heavy, very heavy, and it was lying across the back of both legs, high, above the knees. She needed to know which direction pressure was coming from before she moved it, because moving it the wrong way could make something that was injured into something that was worse. Can you feel your feet? She asked. A pause. Then rough and strained, yes. Both of them? Yes. Mabel, don't move yet. I'm going to lift this branch. When I say push, I want you to push yourself forward, not up, forward. Can you do that? I can do that. His voice was strained and tight, a man managing pain with the specific economy of someone who has managed pain before. The branch was heavy enough that she needed leverage. She looked around, saw the shovel she'd dropped 2 feet away, grabbed it, used the handle under the branch as a pry point, and put her entire body weight onto the other end, and the branch shifted, raised 2 inches, 3. Push, she said. He pushed. He was strong, even hurt, and he moved himself forward through the snow and clear of the branch, and she let it down and dropped the shovel and got to him and put her hand on his back. I'm going to help you roll over, slow. My leg, he said. Which one? Right, it's... I know, slow. She helped him roll. He made a sound he tried to suppress and didn't fully succeed. His face, when she saw it, was white under the cold, drawn tight. He was looking at her with eyes that were very present, which she took as the best available sign. She looked at the right leg. The canvas of his pants wasn't torn, which meant the branch had hit through the fabric. She put her hands on the leg, careful, methodical, feeling the shape of things. Tell me when it changes, she said, and moved her hands from the ankle up. There, he said. Sharp. She was above the knee. Above the knee. Front or back? Back. Right side. She felt carefully. Not broken. She was almost sure. The femur had not moved under her hands the way it would if it were broken, and broken femur meant a kind of bleeding she wouldn't be able to manage up here. What she felt instead was the muscle, and what the muscle felt like was wrong in a specific way she recognized from her mother's medical book and from the one time she'd seen a man take a blow to that same location from a horse's kick. Torn muscle, she said, possibly pulled badly, possibly worse. It's going to swell and it's going to hurt, and you need to be off it until we know what we're dealing with. I can walk. You are not walking on that until I know what's in it. She looked at him. I need to get you to the cabin. That's what we're doing right now. Argue with me later. He looked at her for a second, and she looked back at him, and something in his face made the decision she was apparently not giving him the option of making himself. All right, he said. Getting him to the cabin was not elegant. He couldn't put weight on the right leg without a sound that made her jaw tighten, which meant he was supporting himself primarily on the left, and she was taking the right side, and they moved through the snow in a way that was slow and deeply awkward and required near-constant small adjustments as the snow shifted and the path changed. He was heavy. She was not going to say that to him, or possibly ever to anyone, but she was aware of it, and she was aware that if she stepped wrong and they both went down in the snow, they were going to have a significantly worse problem. She planted each step before committing to it. She kept her arm around him and her shoulder under his right arm, and she moved with the steady, grinding determination of someone who has understood that the current task is not optional. They got inside. She got him to the cot in the storeroom, her cot. The one in the main room was his, and the storeroom was where she could manage him more easily with the door. And she got him lying down, and she got his boot off the right foot before the swelling locked the ankle, and she looked at the leg properly. Bruised, already visibly bruised at the back of the thigh, the color coming up fast. Swelling beginning at the lateral muscle. She felt the length of the muscle carefully, and he was very still and very quiet under her hands, managing it. You're going to be here for a few days, she said. The fence will wait. The stock. I'll do the stock. He was quiet for a moment. You don't know all of it. Then you're going to tell me all of it. She straightened up and looked at him. While I clean and wrap this leg, you're going to tell me exactly what needs doing for the stock and exactly how you do it, and I'm going to do it. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at her. There's a horse, he said. The gray mare. I know her. She gets nervous in confined spaces when it's quiet. She needs to hear a voice. Mabel had not expected that. So I talked to her. He stopped. Just so you know. What do you say to her? A pause. Nothing particular, just whatever. His jaw worked. She doesn't care what, just that someone's there. She looked at him for a moment. He was looking somewhere to the side, not at her. I'll talk to her, she said. She wrapped his leg, firm, not tight, the way her mother had shown her, and she made him drink water, and she built the fire in the storeroom up higher, and she got him positioned with the leg elevated on the folded blanket. She stood in the doorway and looked at him, this large, capable, self-contained man lying on her narrow cot with his leg wrapped and his face still tight with managed pain. Sleep if you can, she said. I'll check on you in an hour. Mabel. He said her name in the way he said it, not a question, not a command, but something that had weight, made her stop. She looked at him. I would have been under that branch, he said. If you hadn't... Don't, she said. I need to say it. Say it later, she said. When your leg doesn't feel like that. He looked at her for a long moment. Later, he agreed. She went out to do the stock, and on the way through the barn, she stopped beside the gray mare and stood close and talked to her. Just whatever, like he'd said, nothing particular. And the mare turned her head and breathed warm air against Mabel's cold cheek, and the barn was quiet around them. And outside, the mountain was clean and white and entirely indifferent to what had just happened, and what had just happened was that everything between them had changed without either of them saying a word about it. The days of Silas's recovery had their own particular rhythm, different from everything that had come before. Mabel ran the homestead alone for the first time, and she understood in those first 2 days the difference between working alongside someone who knew what they were doing and being the person who knew what they were doing. There was no one to ask. There was no one to notice what she missed. The responsibility sat on her differently than any work she'd done before. Not heavier exactly, but wider. It had edges she could feel. She managed. Not perfectly. The first morning she forgot to check the secondary water line that ran from the creek to the stock trough before it froze overnight, and it had frozen, and she spent 40 minutes with a bucket and boiling water correcting it, while the cattle waited with the particular impatience of animals who have opinions about breakfast. She made a note on the paper she now kept in her apron pocket at all times. Check secondary line before dark. Every day. She checked on Silas every hour the first day, which he bore with more patience than she'd expected. He was not a good patient in the sense of being cheerful or uncomplaining, but he was a good patient in the more important sense of actually staying on the cot and not trying to stand on the injured leg when she wasn't looking, which she'd been half expecting. The leg had swelled considerably by the second day, the bruising spreading in a pattern she was monitoring carefully. She'd made a compress from what she had, clean cloth, snow-packed in a feed bag for cold, and a poultice from dried arnica she'd found in the medicine shelf, which her mother had used for exactly this kind of injury and which reduced the swelling visibly over the course of that day. Where did you learn that? He asked, watching her replace the compress. My mother. She dealt with most of the medical situations in our house because the doctor cost money we didn't usually have. She adjusted the wrapping. She had a book. I read most of it by the time I was 14. The Gray's Anatomy, he said. On my shelf. She looked at him. You noticed I'd read it. The spine was different. Someone who reads a book holds it differently than a book that's been sitting on a shelf for years. He paused. I noticed the second day. She tied off the bandage and sat back. You notice a lot of things. I live alone. You pay attention to what changes. He looked at her steadily. The list on the barn door, the way you checked the fence before I'd mentioned it needed checking, the boot print near the trough on the morning you fixed it. He looked at the wrapped leg. You're not what I expected when you came up that mountain. What did you expect? Someone who'd last a week, he said. She was quiet for a moment. What do you think now? He looked at her with that direct, careful look that had become familiar. I think the mountain picked up something the valley didn't know what to do with. She didn't say anything. She gathered the supplies and stood up and said, "Soup in 20 minutes," and went out to the main room, and she stood at the stove with her hands on the pot and let those words settle into her in whatever way they needed to. Wow. By the fourth day he was sitting up, which she allowed, and trying to put weight on the leg, which she didn't. "It's better," he said. "It's less bad. Those are not the same thing. I can feel... You can feel that the sharp part is gone. The damage is still there." She pointed at the cot. "Sit down." He sat, which told her how much the leg was actually bothering him, because Silas Boone would not have sat down under direction if some part of him didn't agree it was correct. "Tell me what else needs doing outside," she said. "You've been managing it." "I've been managing what I know needs managing. What am I missing?" He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't say nothing, or "you've got it the way people do when they want to end a conversation." He went through it methodically. The east fence section she hadn't checked since before the storm, the check on the trap lines he'd set before the storm came, she hadn't known about those, the water level in the hidden cistern under the barn floor that she had not known existed. She added each item to her paper. "The trap lines," she said. "I don't know where they are." "I'll draw it." He reached for the paper and the pencil stub she'd been using, and she handed them over and watched him sketch a rough map. Surprisingly clear, she thought, for a man who'd spent 7 years talking more to a mare than to people. He marked the tree lines, the creek bends, the 6 trap locations in their numbered order. "If there's catch in them, what do I do?" she asked. "Release what you can't process," he said. "If it's already gone, reset. If it's rabbit or squirrel, bring it back. I'll tell you how to dress it when you return." She looked at the map. "You trust me to do this?" "Can you read a map?" "Yes." "Then, yes," he said simply, and handed the paper back. She went out on the 3rd day of his recovery and found the trap lines by the map, which was accurate to within the small margin that comes from trying to render real terrain in pencil on a piece of brown paper. She released 2 and brought back 1 rabbit, and when she came back inside, she stood in the doorway of the storeroom with the rabbit and waited. "Sit down," he said, and talked her through it, and she did it in the main room on the workboard, and it wasn't pretty, but it was done right, and the rabbit went into a pot for supper. "Not bad," he said when she reported it. "The second one would have been cleaner." "Always is," he said. By the 6th day, he was on his feet with a stick she'd cut from a pine branch and trimmed and sized for him, which he used without comment, which meant he needed it. He moved around the main room, limited, checking things the way a person checks a room they've been away from, not looking for change exactly, but re-establishing relationship with the space. He stood at the window a long time. "The north fence," he said. "Done 2 days ago. Posts reset, wire tightened." He turned. "You did the posts?" "You were on a cot. Someone had to." "The posts need a driver." "I found it in the barn. It took me twice as long as it would have taken you, and I had to rest my shoulders twice. But they're in." She looked at him. "I added a 4th post in the weak section. It needed it." He was quiet for a moment. "Show me when I can walk the line." "When you can walk the line, I'll show you." He looked at her. "You're very certain about what I should and shouldn't be doing." "Someone has to be." She said it without heat. "You'd push too fast and re-injure it, and then we'd be back to the cot for another week, which neither of us wants." "You don't know that I'd push too fast." She looked at him steadily. "You were trying to stand on it on the 2nd day." He looked out the window. "That's fair," he said, and that was that. On the 8th day of his recovery, when the leg had gone from crisis to inconvenience and she was beginning to think the worst was genuinely past, he found her in the barn. She was on the floor of the barn's tack corner, reorganizing the bridles and harnesses, which had been a tangle for as long as she'd been here and which she'd been meaning to address for weeks. She heard him come in, the slight unevenness of his step with the leg still healing, the creak of the door, and looked up. He was standing in the doorway with his coat on and his stick in his right hand and the morning light behind him, and he looked at her for a moment with something working in his face that she'd come to recognize as the look he wore when he was about to say something he'd been thinking about for a while. She sat back on her heels and waited. "I need to tell you something," he said. The particular quality of that opening made her pay attention. She put down the bridle she was holding. He came into the barn and stood near the gray mare's stall. Near, not leaning, because the leg was better but not trustworthy yet on uncertain surfaces. And he looked at the mare for a moment before looking at her. "Before the storm," he said. "Before all of it. There were men in Caldwell Junction asking about a woman matching your description." She went very still. "I heard it from a man named Decker. He runs the feed supply down there. He was up here 2 days before the storm with a delivery I'd ordered in fall, and he mentioned it." Silas looked at her directly. "He said 2 men had been in, asking Gerald Fitch at the post office, asking whether anyone had come through looking for work in the hills." She stayed where she was, on her heels on the barn floor, and felt something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What did Gerald tell them?" she asked. "I don't know," Silas said. "I don't know Gerald well enough to know which way he'd go." He paused. "I should have told you before the storm." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know what to do with it. I wanted to think about it first." He looked at her. "I'm not someone who acts before I've thought. That's not always a virtue." She stood up. Her knees protested the cold barn floor, which she ignored. She stood and looked at him and tried to think past the cold thing in her chest. "Theodore," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's my guess. 2 men." She thought about that. Theodore had money. Money bought methodical things. Hired men with directions and a description and enough patience to work through a list of possibilities. Gerald Fitch at the post office in Caldwell Junction had been the one who'd pointed her toward the mountain in the first place. He might remember that. He might, if the money was right, or the pressure was sufficient, mention it. "Does anyone else know I'm here?" she asked. "Decker knows. He saw you the morning he delivered. You were at the trough. He wouldn't have recognized you from a description, but if someone came and asked specifically..." Silas stopped. "Decker's an honest man. He'd answer a direct question directly." She turned away from him and stood looking at the barn wall, at the reorganized tack, the clean lines of the bridles she'd been working on, the order she'd made out of what had been chaos. She looked at all of it and thought about what it meant that someone was looking for her. It meant Theodore was not willing to let the loss of her be a simple fact. She had known this was possible. She had known it at some level when she'd walked out, when she'd climbed this mountain. She had been hoping, and she recognized now that hoping was not the same as planning, that the distance would be enough, that he would assess the effort against the worth of the project and decide the project wasn't worth it. She should have known better. Theodore's pride was not the kind that calculated. It was the kind that had to win simply because losing was intolerable. "I should leave," she said. She said it to the wall. "No," Silas said. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful measuring look, not the open look of the storm days. This was something firmer, something that had made a decision before it was asked to. "This is your home," he said. "You've been here 6 weeks, and it's your home. I'm not going to tell you to leave it. If they come here, then they come here." Silas, 2 men, with Theodore's money behind them. She looked at him. "I won't have you in that position." "What position?" "Between me and whatever he sent." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to understand something," he said. "Are you suggesting that I hand you over to whoever shows up?" "No, I'm suggesting that I leave before they get here so you're not involved." "I'm already involved," he said. It came out flat, like a fact. Like the ridge outside was a fact, and the barn they were standing in was a fact. 6 weeks is involved. The fence is involved. The trough. The trap lines. He looked at her steadily. "You pulled a tree off me. You'd have gotten out." "Maybe," he said. "Mabel." The way he said her name again with that weight. "No one who comes up this mountain uninvited has any business here. That's always been true. It doesn't change based on who they're looking for." She looked at him for a long time. "You have a bad leg," she said. "It's better. It's not fully better." No, he agreed. It's not fully better, but I have a rifle that works fine, and I've been on this mountain for 7 years, and I know every foot of it, and two men from a valley town with money in their pockets are not what I'd call an even match for that combination. He paused. You could also tell me, he said more quietly, what exactly we're dealing with. You've told me some of it. Tell me the rest. She considered this. She had been selective, she knew, in what she'd said about Theodore. Accurate, but partial. The way you tell a story when you're not sure how much of yourself to put into someone else's hands. She sat down on the hay bale she'd been near when he came in. She looked at the barn floor. Then she told him the rest of it. She told him about the money, specifically Theodore's money, which was considerable and came from enough sources that its full extent was impossible to know. She told him about the land, specifically, her mother's house, the two-room house on the east side of Ferris Hollow, which was in Mabel's name as her mother had left it, and which she had not thought about in the rush of leaving, but which she had come to think about in the weeks since, because the house and the small lot it sat on were worth something, and Theodore had made several comments over the course of the engagement about how it would be sensible, once they were married, to consolidate their properties, by which he meant sell her mother's house and add it to his accounts. He can't touch it, she said. Legally, it's in my name and we never married, but Theodore doesn't always wait for legal. She paused. He has people, friends at the county seat, at the assessor's office. If he wanted to make things complicated for the property, he could find ways to do that. What's the property worth? Silas asked. He said it practically, not coldly. The house? Maybe $200. The lot. The land my mother owned, maybe twice that. There's a water easement. She looked up. It's not a fortune, but Theodore doesn't collect because he needs the money. He collects because he keeps track of what he considers his. Silas was quiet. He'd lowered himself onto the stool near the mare's stall at some point without her noticing, and he was sitting with his hands between his knees and that thinking look on his face. Does anyone in Ferris Hollow know your mother's property is yours? Not just assumed, but documented? The deed. It was filed at the county records when she died and the estate settled. My name's on it. Who handled that? A man named Birch, Harlan Birch. He's a land clerk at the county seat. He was honest. She paused. I think he was honest. You need someone to verify it still reads the way it should, Silas said. Land records can get muddled if someone knows how to muddle them. Not always illegally. Sometimes just procedurally, filing things that create complications. She looked at him. You know about that. I've seen it happen, he said carefully. When I had the Valley Farm, a neighbor had something similar. Someone who wanted his land filed a water rights dispute that wasn't legitimate but took 18 months to clear. He met her eyes. It's a long game, expensive to play, but someone with money and patience can make owning a property so complicated that the owner gives it up just to be free of the complication. She sat with that for a moment. Theodore has patience, she said, when it suits him. Then you need a record, Silas said. Something you have, not just something filed somewhere that other people can access. He paused. Letters. From this Birch, confirming the status of the deed. Your own copy of the filed document if you don't have one. I don't have one. I left in a hurry. Then we write to Birch. He said it as though this were a practical step that had presented itself and required action, which was how he approached most things. Get him to send a certified copy here. Takes time by mail, but it establishes that the record exists and you've confirmed it. We'd have to go down to Caldwell Junction to post it, with two men possibly asking questions there. I can post it, he said. My leg will carry me that far in another week, and no one's looking for me. He paused. Decker at the feed store is trustworthy. He'll tell me if those men came back and what they asked and what he said. She looked at him. He was laying this out the way she laid out the morning's work, methodical, one item leading to the next. The whole thing built on practical consequence rather than feeling. She had sat in rooms with people who talked about problems in circles for the pleasure of the talking, and she had sat in rooms with people who, when they heard a problem, quietly started building the response. Silas was the second kind. You'd do all that, she said. I'd do all that, he said. Matter of fact. She looked down at the barn floor. I should tell you, she said, that even with the property sorted, Even if the deed is clean and he can't touch it, he's still going to send people looking, not for the house, for me. She looked up, because that's what he does with things he considers his. He accounts for them. Silas held her gaze. Then we deal with that when it comes. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, he said, but it's not complicated either. Someone comes up my mountain uninvited looking to take something that doesn't belong to them. He stopped. I've dealt with that before. Different context, same principle. She looked at him for a long moment. The mare moved in her stall, a soft shifting of weight, the warm animal smell of her settling into the cold barn air. Tell me what you're thinking, she said. I'm thinking you've been carrying this alone since you left, he said. And you could have told me earlier and didn't because you didn't want to be a burden. He said the last words plainly, without accusation. And I want you to know that you're not. She didn't say anything. You're not a burden, he said again. You're the person who reset my fence posts and fixed my smokehouse and pulled a tree off me. You're not a burden. You're... He stopped, looking for the word, and found it. You're a partner. That's what you are. And partners tell each other things. She looked at her hands. They were rough now in a way they hadn't been 6 weeks ago. Work roughened, differently shaped by what they'd been doing. She turned them over and looked at the palms, which had calluses in new places. All right, she said. All right, you'll tell me things? Or all right generally? She looked up at him. Both, she said. Something settled in his face. He stood up from the stool, slowly testing the leg. He was steadier than yesterday. He picked up his stick and looked at the bridles she'd been reorganizing. You put the driving harness on the wrong hook, he said. She looked. He was right. I didn't know which one was the driving harness. The heavy rings. It goes on the high hook so the rings don't drag. He pointed. I'll move it. I'll do it, he said. And he did, reaching up and moving the harness to its correct hook, one-handed, the stick under his other arm. They stood in the barn together with the work redistributed to its right places, and the cold settled around them and the gray mare at her grain. And Mabel thought that she had told him the thing she'd been carrying and the weight of it had not redistributed to him. It had simply become shared, which was a different thing, a better thing, the difference between dropping a load on someone and someone reaching under it beside you. The letter to Birch, she said. I'll draft it tonight if you tell me what it needs to say. I'll write it. He knows my name. A letter in my hand is more straightforward. Fair, he said. They went back to the cabin. She wrote the letter to Harlan Birch that evening at the table, with Silas across from her reading the almanac he'd had since before she arrived, and consulting it with the seriousness of a man who planned by weather and season rather than by calendar. She wrote carefully, in her clearest hand, keeping it factual. Her name, the property, the request for certified confirmation of the deed's current registered status, and address for reply. She did not explain why she needed it. Birch was a practical man and didn't need explaining. He needed instruction. She sealed it when she was done and set it on the table. Silas looked at it, then back at the almanac. I'll go down in 4 days, he said, leg permitting. 5, she said. 4, he said, and turned a page. She didn't argue. 4 was probably right. The leg was healing faster than a bad injury, slower than he wanted, which put it somewhere she could accept. 3 days later, not 4, not 5, which was the mountain's way of making decisions nobody had budgeted for. The men came. She was at the fence on the east property line when she heard the horses, 2 of them coming up the main trail. She could hear the particular sound of horses picking their way up uncertain ground, the irregular rhythm of it. She stayed where she was for a moment, her hands on the fence wire, and listened. Then she walked back toward the cabin. She didn't run. Running felt like a statement she didn't want to make, to herself or anyone watching. She walked at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried, and she got to the cabin and went inside, and she said quietly into the room, Silas. He was at the far side of the main room, checking the wall seam they'd been meaning to re-chink. He heard her tone and stopped. Horses, she said. 2, coming up the main trail. He looked at her for 1 second, calibrating. Then he went to the wall near the door where the rifle hung on its pegs, and he took it down, and he checked it the way someone checks something they maintain properly. quickly because it was already as it should be. "Go to the storeroom," he said. "I'm not—" "Mabel." He looked at her. "I'm not sending you away. I'm putting you where I know you're safe while I see who this is. If it's nobody, I'll call you out." She looked at him, at the rifle in his hands, easy, like it belonged there, at the expression on his face, which was not afraid, not even close to afraid, but entirely and completely serious in the way of someone who has decided how this is going to go and is simply waiting for it to begin. She went to the storeroom and left the door open an inch. She heard the horses stop in the yard. She heard a voice, not Silas's, call out something she couldn't make out. Then Silas's voice from the porch, clear and without any particular warmth. "State your business." Another voice, the same one. She pressed closer to the door gap. "Looking for a woman," the words came through imperfectly. "Came up from Ferris Hollow. Name's Mabel Ashcroft. We were told she might be—" "Who told you?" Silas's voice. A pause. Then the other voice again, and in it she could hear something recalibrating. Whoever this was had expected a different kind of reception than they were currently receiving. "We've been hired to locate her. She left of her own will," Silas said. "That's not the same as lost." "Mr. Boone," Silas said, "this is my property. You're on it without invitation. I'll ask again, who hired you?" A longer pause. She could feel through the gap in the door the particular quality of silence that comes when two men are looking at a third man with a rifle and reconsidering the morning's ambitions. "Man named Vance," the voice said. "Theodore Vance. She's his nothing," Silas said. The words came out quiet and clear, each one entirely separate from the others. "Not his fiancée, not his property, not his concern. She lives here. This is her home. You've delivered your message and heard mine. I'd suggest you take the trail back down while it's still light enough to do it safely." Silence. Then, different voice, a second man who hadn't spoken yet. Lower, more careful. "Mr. Boone, we're not here for trouble. We're hired men with a job." "Your job is done," Silas said. "You found her. She's here. She doesn't want to be found by Theodore Vance or anyone Vance sends. That's the information you were paid to find. Take it back to him." A long pause. "He won't be satisfied with that," the first voice said. Different tone now, less professional, more like something that thought it should be taken seriously. "That's between him and his satisfaction," Silas said. "Nothing about that is my problem or hers. You've got about 2 hours of good light. Use them." Mabel stood with her eye to the inch-wide gap, and she could not see the yard from this angle, but she could hear it. The particular sound of horses shifting under riders who were making decisions. The creak of saddle leather, a low exchange between the two men she couldn't make out. Then hoofbeats. Moving away. Down the trail. She waited. "Mabel," Silas called. She came out of the storeroom. He was still on the porch, still holding the rifle, watching the tree line where the trail disappeared. His shoulders had a particular set to them, not relaxed exactly, but out of the forward position that means immediate readiness. She came out and stood beside him, and they both looked at the tree line. "They'll go back to Theodore," she said. "Yes. And he'll send someone else, or come himself." "Probably." He lowered the rifle. "But not today and not tomorrow. We have time." "Time for what?" "The letter to Birch," he said. "I'm going to Caldwell Junction tomorrow, leg or not." He looked at her. "And I'm going to stop by and have a conversation with Decker about what he told those men and how much they know." He paused. "And I'm going to find out what Gerald Fitch said to them, because Gerald Fitch is going to account for whatever part he played in this." She looked at him. He was still watching the tree line, his profile set and certain. "You're not just going to post the letter," she said. "No," he said. "I'm going to take care of things." He finally turned and looked at her. "This is our home. I'm going to take care of it." She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had told her to leave the first day and meant it, who had watched her 6 weeks of work with the careful attention of someone who didn't trust quickly and changed his mind on evidence, who had lain on her narrow cot with a busted leg and told her she was a partner. She thought about Theodore, who had taken her mother's brooch and told her she was a project. She thought about the difference between those two things, which was immense, which was perhaps the whole distance between one kind of life and another. "I'm coming with you," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not hiding in the storeroom while you handle this," she said. "It's my name on that deed. It's my letter to Birch. And Theodore sent those men because of me, which means I have something to say about what happens next." She met his eyes. "I'm coming." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the tree line. "We leave at first light," he said. She went inside to start supper, and the mountain settled into its evening around the cabin, and the trail that led down to the valley was empty and would be for one more night, and the fire in the stove worked against the cold, and the home she had made out of a cold barn and a crooked door, and 6 weeks of mornings before dawn, held itself together in the way that things hold together when they've been built right. They left at first light, as Silas had said. The trail down was harder on his leg than the flat ground of the homestead, and she knew this because she watched the way he moved. Not the leg itself, which he would not have let her examine in motion, but the specific tightening around his jaw on the downhill sections where the grade put pressure on the healing muscle. He used the stick, and he didn't complain, and he set a pace that was slower than his usual and faster than she'd have chosen for him, which was the compromise she accepted because she'd learned the edge of where he could be managed and where he simply wasn't going to be. They didn't talk much on the way down. The trail required attention, and they were both thinking she could feel it. The particular quality of silence between two people who are walking toward something and using the walking to prepare. She thought about Theodore. She had been thinking about him in a different way since the men had come and gone. Before, her thoughts about Theodore had been reactive. She heard his name, or thought his name, and the immediate response was something cold and armoring, the reflex of a person who has been managing something difficult for a long time. But since yesterday, since standing on the porch with Silas and watching the hired men ride down the mountain, something had shifted in the architecture of her fear. It was still there. She wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. But it was smaller. Or rather, she was the same size she'd always been, and Theodore had stopped expanding to fill all the available space. He was what he was, a man with money and wounded pride and the particular smallness of someone who needs to own things to feel that they exist. She'd spent 11 months in the shadow of that and mistaken the shadow for the substance, and she was done with that mistake. The trail opened into the lower valley around mid-morning. Caldwell Junction was not large. It had never been large. But after 6 weeks on the mountain, it looked different to her than it had when she'd passed through going the other direction. She noticed details she hadn't noticed before, the way the buildings sat in the valley as though they'd been set down and forgotten, the particular quality of valley noise, which was different from mountain noise, more diffuse, less directional. "Decker first," Silas said, "then the post office." "Not Gerald Fitch first?" "I want to know what Decker told them before I talk to Fitch. What Decker says tells me what Fitch might have added." She considered this. "You think through things carefully." "I think through things slowly," he said. "There's a difference." He looked ahead at the junction's main street. "Slowly has kept me out of most of the trouble I could have gotten into." Decker's feed supply was at the south end of the junction's main street, a wide, practical building that smelled of grain and saddle soap and the particular dusty warmth of dry goods stored in bulk. The man behind the counter was short and broad, with a gray beard that looked like it hadn't fully decided what shape it wanted to be, and he looked up when they came in, and his face went through a quick series of expressions. Surprise, then something more careful, then a kind of settled frankness that she thought probably represented his natural state. "Silas," he said, "legs better, I see." "Getting there." Silas put both hands on the counter. "The two men who came up last week, Decker, what did they ask you, and what did you tell them?" Decker's expression didn't flinch. "They asked if I'd made a delivery to your place recently. I said yes. They asked if there was anyone other than you on the property when I delivered. I said yes, a woman, didn't know her name." He paused. "That's all I told them, Silas. They pushed for more, and I told them I wasn't in the business of keeping track of who lived where." "Did they say who sent them?" "Not by name. Mentioned they were working for someone from down Ferris Hollow way." Decker's eyes moved briefly to Mabel, then back. "I put it together." "Thank you," Mabel said. He looked at her directly. "None of my business," he said. "People live where they live. I deliver feed." He picked up the ledger he'd been writing in before they came. Silas, you'll want your spring order in early this year. I'm running short on the oat mix. I'll come back for that, Silas said, after we deal with the post office. They went to the post office. Gerald Fitch was, as described, short and red-faced, and he was also, she saw immediately, a man who knew why they were there before they said a word, because the guilt of it was sitting on his face like something he'd been carrying since the moment those men had ridden out. Silas put the letter on the counter. I need this posted, he said. Fitch picked it up and looked at the address and set it down. Silas, I know they came to you, Silas said. I know they asked about a woman, and I know you told them. I need to know exactly what you said, and I need you to tell me straight. Fitch's color deepened. They had money, he said. I've got 3 kids, and the post office doesn't— Gerald. Silas's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. What did you tell them? Fitch looked at the counter. I told them a woman came through. Came through about 6-7 weeks back, asked about work in the hills. I told them I'd pointed her toward your place. He paused. I told them that was probably where she'd gone. Silence. I didn't think they'd— Fitch started. They came up my mountain, Silas said. They asked for her by name. They were paid to take her back to a man who has no legal or any other claim on her. Fitch's face was fully red now. He looked at Mabel with the specific shame of someone who hadn't thought far enough past the money to the consequence. I'm sorry, he said. I need something from you, Mabel said. She hadn't planned to speak, but she found she had something to say. If anyone else comes asking, anyone at all, with any kind of story about me, any kind of offer, I need you to tell them nothing. Tell them you don't know. Tell them you don't remember. I can do that. Gerald. She waited until he met her eyes. I need you to mean it. He held her gaze, and she saw the man under the excuse and the shame. Not a bad man, she thought, but a man who had taken the easy thing in a moment and was now sitting with the weight of it. I mean it, he said. I'm sorry, miss. I am. She picked up the letter and pushed it across the counter. Post that, please, she said. Certified. Return receipt. He took it with both hands. They stopped for coffee at the small diner that operated out of the building next to the livery. 2 tables and a counter, and a woman named Ruth who poured without asking and charged what was fair. Silas sat with his legs stretched out and his hands around his cup, and Mabel sat across from him, and they drank their coffee, and she thought about what came next. Theodore won't stop with 2 men, she said. I know. He'll come himself eventually. He doesn't like unsettled accounts. She looked at the cup. He'll come and he'll try to make it seem like he's the wronged party. He's very good at that, at reframing everything so that his version is the one that stands. What does he want? Silas asked. Really, past the pride. She thought about it. Control, she said. He wants the account closed in his favor. He wants me to come back, or at least to have been proven wrong for leaving. If I'm gone and prospering somewhere, that's an argument he lost. He can't tolerate that. She looked up. The property, my mother's house, is part of it too. It's something he can take if he makes enough legal noise. He knows how to do that. The letter to Birch will establish the current status of the deed, Silas said. If there's been any interference with the record, Birch can tell us. And if there has been, then we get it corrected. He said it simply. There are men in the county seat who aren't Theodore's friends. Property law is clear enough on inheritance. If the deed is in your name and was properly filed, interference with it is not a gray area legally. He paused. It might still cost time and money to sort, but it can be sorted. She looked at him. He was working through this the way he worked through the morning's list, methodical, piece by piece, not catastrophizing but not minimizing either. She had spent 11 months with a man who made everything feel larger and more threatening than it needed to be because a frightened woman was easier to manage. The contrast was sharp enough to cut. I want to write a letter to Theodore as well, she said. Silas looked at her. What kind of letter? A clear one. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. I've been running and hiding and hoping the distance would be enough. It's not enough. And I knew it wasn't enough. And I think some part of me needed to see those men ride up before I could stop pretending it was. She looked at her coffee. I need to write to him directly. Tell him the engagement is ended, formally and without ambiguity, in writing, with the date. Tell him the property is mine and will remain mine, and any interference with it will be challenged. Tell him that I am living my life and he has no part in it. Can you do that without it coming back at you in some way? Yes, she said, because I'm not asking him. I'm informing him. She looked up. There's a difference. Asking him opens a conversation. Informing him closes one. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, all right, write it here. Ruth will have paper. Ruth did. She produced a sheet of paper and a pen from somewhere behind the counter without being asked for explanation, the way of someone who'd seen enough of life's business conducted at her two tables not to require elaboration. Mabel wrote the letter to Theodore Vance at the diner table, with Silas's coffee cooling beside him and Ruth's diner sounds in the background and the morning light coming through the single window at an angle that was useful for seeing clearly. She wrote it short. She had always been told she was too much, too large, too talkative, too emotional, too inconveniently present in spaces that didn't want her. She wrote this letter small and precise, and she did not apologize in it, not once. And she did not explain herself beyond what was legally relevant, because she owed him explanation the way the mountain owed the valley an accounting of its weather. She didn't. She signed it with her full name. She dated it. She slid it across to Silas. Read it if you want. He read it. He set it down. He picked up his coffee. Good, he said. They posted both letters before they left Caldwell Junction. The ride back up the mountain was harder than the ride down, as it always was, and they stopped twice, once at the creek crossing where the water was running high with snowmelt, and once at the second ridge where Silas's leg had said enough and needed 10 minutes before continuing. She didn't comment on the stop. She used the 10 minutes to check the snare she'd noticed on the trail edge that morning, old, someone else's, long abandoned, and pulled it and coiled the wire to bring back. Whose is that? She asked. Terrence Abbott's, probably. He ran lines up here years ago before he moved east. Silas watched her coil the wire efficiently. You've gotten good at that. At coiling wire? At noticing things. He said it without particular emphasis. The way he said things he meant simply. She looked at the coiled wire in her hand. 6 weeks ago she hadn't known what a snare wire looked like up close. She'd learned the trap lines from a pencil sketch on brown paper while a man lay on her cot with a damaged leg. She'd reset fence posts and fixed smokehouse chimneys and talked to a gray mare about nothing in particular and found that nothing in particular was enough. She'd climbed a mountain in town boots. Let's keep moving, she said. And they did. They were back at the homestead by late afternoon. The cabin sat in the clearing the way it always sat. Solid, unpretentious, exactly what it was, and she felt, coming out of the tree line into the clearing, the same thing she'd felt the first time she'd crossed this clearing, which was the awareness of space. Not emptiness. Space. The difference being that emptiness is the absence of something wanted, and space is room for something coming. Silas went to check the horses. She went inside to start the fire and begin supper. The stove was cold. They'd been gone since morning, and starting it from scratch was its own small sequence of tasks that she'd done enough times now that her hands knew the order without consulting her mind. Paper, small wood, larger wood, the particular angle of the damper that the left side running oven required to draft correctly. She had this stove figured down to its stubbornness. She stood up from the stove when it was going and looked around the cabin. The door that hung true. The window with the proper stuffing in the gap. The clean floor. The wood box full. The table that was her table now as much as it was his. The chair that had become hers by accumulation and agreement. The list that wasn't on the barn door anymore because the barn door list was done, and the second list was mostly done, and she'd need to start a third. This was what she'd made in 6 weeks, out of the raw materials of a difficult situation and a mountain and a man who'd told her to leave at first meeting. She thought about something Silas had said back in those early days. The mountain doesn't know you from before. He'd been talking about why he'd come here himself, what the mountain gave him that the valley hadn't been able to after Clara died. But she'd turned those words over many times since, the way you turn a stone and find it's different on the other side. She had not come to the mountain to be unknown. She'd come to the mountain because she needed to start from what was actually true about her rather than what 11 months of Theodore Vance's version of her had layered over the truth. The mountain had given her that, not by being gentle, it had been the opposite of gentle, but by being indifferent to anything that wasn't real. The mountain didn't care what size she was. The fence didn't care. The frozen water line didn't care. The tree that came down on Silas didn't care. What the mountain cared about, if caring was the right word, was what you actually did. And she had found out what she actually did. She fixed things. She noticed things. She kept track of what mattered and went after it methodically and didn't stop when she was uncomfortable. She had always been this person. She'd been this person the whole time she was in Ferris Hollow, the whole 11 months of Theodore's management of her, and what those months had done was pile enough noise on top of that truth that she'd forgotten it was there. The mountain had been quiet enough to hear it again. Theodore Vance came himself 3 weeks later. She was in the garden, the kitchen garden on the south side of the cabin that she'd started laying out with the first warm weeks of early spring, turning the soil in sections, amending it with the composted material from the pile she'd started in January. She heard the horse on the trail, and she knew before she saw him. There was something in the way the sound of a single horse came up a trail that was different from two horses, and this was a single horse, and it was moving at the pace of someone who had prepared what he was going to say and was taking his time about arriving to say it. She stood up from the garden. He rode into the clearing looking precisely as she'd last seen him, immaculate in that particular way of men who spend money to appear as though effort is beneath them, well-mounted, composed. He pulled up at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cabin, then at her, and she watched the calculation happen on his face, the rapid reassessment of whatever he'd been expecting against what he was seeing. He had been expecting, she thought, the woman he'd left behind in Ferris Hollow, the one who stood carefully and spoke carefully and managed herself in the presence of his appraisal. She was in garden clothes. Her hands were dirty. She was standing in the middle of a half-turned kitchen garden on the side of a mountain with her hair coming out of its braid, and she looked back at him with the specific steadiness of someone who has nothing to defend. "Mabel," he said. "Theodore," she said. Same tone, same nothing in it. He dismounted. He didn't tie the horse, that small arrogance of assuming the horse would wait for him, which it probably would because expensive horses were trained to. He walked toward her and stopped 8 feet away and looked at her the way he always looked at her, like a ledger entry he was trying to balance. "You look different," he said. "I live differently," she said. "This is—" He looked around the clearing, at the cabin, the barn, the fence line, the garden where she was standing. His expression moved through several things quickly. "You're living here, on this man's property." "On this homestead," she said. "Yes." "Mabel." He said her name with a particular weariness, as though she was being difficult in a way that exhausted him. "You left an engagement. You didn't tell me where you were going. I've spent months." "The engagement ended when I sent you a letter," she said. "Which I did, the day I left." "A letter is not—" "It's a legal document, Theodore, dated and signed. It terminates the arrangement." She kept her voice even. "I wrote to you again from Caldwell Junction 3 weeks ago, confirming the same. You have both letters." His jaw tightened. "You can't simply leave—" "I did simply leave," she said. "People are allowed to end engagements. That is a thing that happens in the world." He looked at her, that cataloging look, looking for the crack, the soft place where she could be pushed. "And your property, your mother's house. You can't manage property from a mountain, Mabel. You're not—" "The deed is registered in my name," she said. "I've had that confirmed by Harlan Birch at the county seat. In writing. I have a certified copy." She paused. "I also know about the water rights dispute you filed in February. Birch tells me the filing has procedural problems and will be dismissed." She held his gaze. "Don't do that again." He was quiet. She'd surprised him. She could see it. Not that she knew, but that she'd been prepared. He had expected to have to educate her. He had expected, she thought, to come up this mountain and find a woman who'd spent weeks in isolation, growing uncertain, and would be relieved to have someone arrive who had the answers. "What are you doing up here?" he said, and for the first time the slick surface of him cracked slightly, and underneath it was something more genuine, which was actual bewilderment. He genuinely could not understand what she had found here that was worth this. "This isn't— You're not built for this, Mabel. You know that." "I don't know that," she said. "I spent a long time believing it because you told me to." She took her dirty garden gloves off, one, then the other, and held them. "I fixed the fence on this property. I repaired the smokehouse, the barn door, the cabin window, the porch rail. I reset fence posts after a blizzard and ran trap lines from a map and nursed a man with a torn leg muscle back to where he could walk without a stick." She looked at him steadily. "None of that is what a woman who isn't built for something does." "Mabel, I want you to go home, Theodore." She said it without heat and without apology. "I want you to get back on that horse and ride down this mountain, and I want you to let this be finished, because it is finished. It was finished the day I left." He looked at her for a long moment. Behind her, she heard the cabin door. Silas came out. He came onto the porch, and he stood there, not moving, not reaching for anything, not saying anything, just present. The way the mountain was present, not threatening exactly, but large and permanent and entirely clear about its own nature. Theodore looked at him. Whatever he was going to say, she would never know what it was. She had theories. He didn't say it. He looked at Silas and then back at her, and he did the calculation that men like Theodore always did. What is this going to cost me? What are the odds? Is the winning of this worth the price of the fight? She could see him arrive at the answer. "This isn't over," he said. But it was the voice of a man who knows something is over and can't yet make himself admit it to his own face. "It is," she said. He stood for one more moment. Then he walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode out of the clearing without looking back. She stood in the garden and watched him go until the sound of the horse on the trail had faded completely. Then she looked down at her gloves and put them back on and went back to the section of soil she'd been turning. Behind her, she heard Silas's boots on the porch steps. He came to the edge of the garden and stopped. She kept working. "He's gone," Silas said. "I know." A pause. "You all right?" She turned a section of soil. "Yes," she said, and she was. She could feel that she was, and was faintly surprised by it, the way you're surprised when a wound you've been bracing around turns out to be healed. "He's smaller than I remembered." Silas said nothing. "In my head, he was—" She stopped, turned more soil. "I gave him a lot of room in my head for a long time. He takes up less of it now." "Good," Silas said. Just that. She worked for a while in silence. He stayed at the edge of the garden, not helping. This was her project, he knew that, had not once offered unsolicited opinion on the layout or the planting plan, just present. The way he was present generally, solid and quiet and entirely himself. "The beans can go in the south section," she said eventually. "The south section gets more sun in late afternoon," he said. "Good for beans." "That's what I thought." She moved to the south section. He went back inside. The letter from Harlan Birch arrived 6 weeks after she'd posted hers, forwarded up from Caldwell Junction by Decker, who made a delivery in early May. It confirmed the deed, listed it intact and unencumbered. The water rights dispute Theodore had filed had been dismissed exactly as Birch had predicted, and a note in Birch's careful hand said, "I would recommend keeping this copy in a secure location. The property stands clearly in your name. Let me know if further confirmation is required." She read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in the tin box on the shelf where she kept the things that mattered. The pearl brooch, which she'd brought up the mountain in her coat pocket, and which sat in the tin box because it was her mother's, and this was where it lived now. The letters she'd sent and copies she'd kept, and now this. Silas was at the table when she turned around. He'd been working on the account book he kept for the homestead's supplies and income, which was a quarterly task that produced in him a specific expression of focused displeasure that she'd come to find quietly funny. "Deed's clear," she said. He looked up. Something in his face settled. Good. Birch says keep the copy somewhere secure. Tin box, he said, and looked back at the accounts. She stood there for a moment with the tin box in her hands and looked at him at the table in the cabin that she'd cleaned and repaired and made habitable in the weeks after she'd arrived. And she thought about the question of what makes a place a home, and arrived, not for the first time, at the same answer. It isn't the structure. The structure can be good or bad, solid or falling apart. It isn't the land, though the land matters. It's the accumulation, the small daily decisions to stay, the work done on behalf of the place rather than from obligation to it. The mornings started together and the evenings ended together, the lists and the letters and the conversations at a table by a fire. Home is not found. It's built. Slowly, imperfectly, by people who are willing to keep at it. She put the tin box back on the shelf. The south fence will need attention before the summer cattle rotation, she said. I know, I was thinking next week. I'll start the post this week, better to get ahead of it. He made a note in the account book. The wire's in the barn. Second shelf, left side. I know where the wire is, she said. You also put the driving harness on the wrong hook that one time, he said, without looking up. I like to be sure. She looked at the back of his head, the particular set of his shoulders at the table, the way his hand moved across the page, careful, deliberate, making things accurate. She thought about a man who had lived alone for 7 years on a mountain and had apparently been perfectly functional and still somehow had a porch rail that needed fixing and a barn full of things he'd been meaning to get to and a cabin where only the shelf he cared about was in any real order. She thought about the space that had needed someone to fill it and hadn't known that until someone showed up. Silas, she said. He looked up. The driving harness thing was one time, she said, 4 months ago. The thing that had been practicing being a smile since February finally committed to it. It was not a big smile. It was the kind that starts at the corners and doesn't travel far, brief and real, and entirely his. I know, he said, but I like that it bothers you. She shook her head and went to the stove to check what was cooking, and the afternoon light did what it did in early May through the cabin windows, clear and real and particular to this place. And the mountain was outside being what it had always been, and what she had worked out over the course of a winter that had tried many things and failed to break any of them was that she had not come to this mountain looking for love or for safety or even for belonging. She'd come looking for herself, for the version of herself that existed when no one was telling her what she was. She'd found that. And then, quietly, without announcement, without any of the drama she'd been taught to associate with the word, she'd also found the rest. What she had with Silas was not the romance she'd read about in younger years. It had no speeches, no grand declarations, nothing that would have satisfied anyone looking for that kind of story. What it had instead was the porch rail fixed on the first day, and the boots left by the stove without a word, and the map drawn on brown paper, and the specific weight of a man's arm when you're helping him through 4 feet of snow. It had the mare's warm breath against a cold cheek. It had 1 month offered and not taken back. It had him saying, "This is your home," with a rifle in his hands, and meaning it from somewhere below all the surfaces. She had learned something this winter that she thought was worth knowing, not just for herself, though it had been necessary for herself, but as a thing that was true in the world. The people who love you without requiring you to be smaller, quieter, thinner, easier, less, are not common, but they exist. They are worth climbing mountains for. They are worth fixing porch rails to find, and sometimes they are already at the top. The summer came the way mountain summers come, sudden and full and brief. The way things are when they know they don't have long. The kitchen garden she'd laid out in May produced imperfectly, abundantly. The cattle rotation went smoothly, the south fence holding because she'd gotten to the posts early. The gray mare lost her nervousness about the silence on a warm July morning when Mabel stayed in the barn 3 hours past necessity, talking about nothing in particular, and after that the mare was simply a horse rather than an anxious one, which Silas noticed without saying how. He said other things instead, slowly, the way he did everything. One evening in late summer she was on the porch in the cool before dark, looking at the clearing, at the garden, and the repaired barn and the fence that she could see a section of from here standing straight, and he came out and sat beside her. Not at the other end of the porch, beside her. She felt the fact of it and kept looking at the clearing and let the silence be what it was, which was not empty. This came out right, he said. She knew he meant more than the evening. Yes, she said. I told you to leave, he said. First day. You did. I was wrong. She looked at him. He was looking at the clearing, the specific expression of a man making an account that he wants to get accurate. You weren't wrong, she said. You didn't know me. No. A pause. I know you now. She looked back at the clearing. The last of the evening light was in the high pines, that particular gold that doesn't last long. Below the tree line, the clearing was already in shade, cool and quiet, and the fence ran its straight line across it like something that had decided where it stood. I know you too, she said. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the porch rail, not the rail she'd repaired that first week. That one had needed replacing in the spring, but the new one, solid under their hands, going nowhere. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that while the light left the pines and the mountain settled into its evening, and the homestead held itself together around them the way things do when they've been built carefully, piece by piece, by people who understood from the beginning that it was the work itself, not the destination, not the moment of arrival, but the daily, imperfect, necessary work that made anything worth having. That was what she'd learned on this mountain. That was what she'd carry, not the bitterness of the valley or the shame of the years she'd spent making herself smaller, not even the dramatic moments, the storm, the fallen tree, the men on horses, Theodore's face going through its calculation before he rode away. What she'd carry was the morning list and the tin of red-lidded pitch and the boots by the stove that hadn't fit quite right, the sound of a man's voice in a barn telling a nervous mare that someone was there. All the small things that had added up, unannounced, to a life.